There is a question that sits at the very edge of what the Warhammer 40K universe is willing to answer. Not a question about who will win a battle, or whether the Imperium can survive another century of unending war across a million fronts, or even whether the Emperor of Mankind still lives on the Golden Throne, or simply persists in some form of agonized stasis that makes the word living feel almost cruel in its inaccuracy. Those questions are enormous and complex and deeply woven into the fabric of the setting, yes. But this one is different. This one reaches past the borders of the galaxy itself, past the outermost stars of the Milky Way, into the cold and lightless void between galaxies, into the darkness between stars, where nothing lives and nothing moves, and the silence is so absolute that even the concepts we use to describe sound feel inadequate to capture how complete the absence is. It asks something that should, by rights, be unanswerable. What is the most dangerous creature in the known universe running from? Sit with that question for a moment before we try to answer it. Really sit with it, because the creature in question is not some minor threat. It is not one of the lesser horrors that the galaxy has learned to manage over 10,000 years of perpetual war. What we are talking about is the Great Devourer, the Tyranids, the hive mind, an entity so vast that its true body is distributed across entire fleets of living warships and billions upon billions of individual organisms, all connected to a singular intelligence that spans interstellar distances and has been consuming worlds since before recorded human history, possibly since before the birth of human civilization altogether. An entity that does not want your territory or your resources or your worship. An entity that wants you dissolved into component biological matter and fed into a reproduction cycle that produces more of itself. This is what we are asking. What made that run? Because here is the thing. The Tyranids have consumed worlds. They have consumed star systems. There is a line in the lore that appears in some sources suggesting they have consumed something approaching 1,000 galaxies, though the exact number is disputed even among Imperial scholars. They are the Great Devourer, the hive mind. A gestalt consciousness of such incomprehensible scale that it makes the gods of chaos look almost personable. They do not want your territory. They do not want your resources in any conventional sense. They do not want your worship or your submission or even your death. Not exactly. What they want, what they have always wanted, is your biomass. Every cell of every living creature on every world they reach, reduced to soup, fed back into the swarm, made into more teeth, and they cross the void between galaxies to get here. That part is where this story moves from merely disturbing into something that, if you really let it land, is one of the most genuinely unsettling pieces of world-building in the entire setting. Because crossing the void between galaxies is not a casual journey, and the Tyranids did not arrive in the Milky Way by accident. The distance between the Milky Way and the nearest major galaxy, Andromeda, is roughly 2.5 million light-years. The Tyranids do not use the warp. They cannot. The raw matter of chaos offers them nothing. No sustenance, no purchase, only interference. So they travel through real space, using specialized organisms called narwhals to manipulate gravitational fields and achieve faster-than-light travel. Even so, that is an almost incomprehensibly long journey to make in the dark, with no guarantee of food at the end. Why would you do that? Why would any organism, even one of this scale, make that crossing? There are two answers that Imperial scholars tend to offer when they whisper about this in the back rooms of fortresses and research stations, away from the kinds of ears that would have them executed for voicing such thoughts aloud. The first answer is hunger. Maybe the Tyranids consumed everything in their last galaxy. Every world, every star system, every pocket of biological matter that could sustain the swarm. And when there was nothing left, the hive mind did what it has always done. It pressed on, searching for the next source of biomass. In this reading, the Tyranids are here because they are hungry, and we were lit up like a beacon in the dark. The second answer is worse, much worse, because the second answer is that something made them leave. Something in the dark between galaxies, or something back where they came from, something that even the Great Devourer does not want to face. And if that is true, then what is currently tearing its way through Imperial space, stripping worlds to bare rock, and dissolving entire civilizations into nutrient broth, that thing is running away from something even more terrible. Sit with that for a moment. We are going to spend a long time today pulling this question apart from every angle. We are going to look at what the Tyranids actually are, how they think, how they travel, what they have done to the galaxy since they arrived. We are going to trace the chain of events that led to them noticing the Milky Way in the first place, back to a single desperate act during the Horus Heresy that echoed across the intergalactic void. We are going to examine every theory that credible lore has put forward for why they came, and why some of those theories are scarier than others. And we are going to ask the question that the setting itself refuses to fully answer. Not because the writers forgot to answer it, but because the not knowing is the point. This is going to take a while. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you want to. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing who is on the other end of these videos. And if you have not already subscribed, please do. It costs you nothing, it means a great deal, and there is a lot more of this kind of content coming. Part 1. Understanding the Great Devourer. Before you can ask what the Tyranids are running from, you need to understand what the Tyranids actually are, because the answer to that question is stranger than most people realize when they first encounter the faction. They are not an army in any conventional sense. They are not a civilization. They are not even really a species. Not in the way humans are a species, or orcs are a species, or even the Eldari are a species. The Tyranids are something closer to a weather system that thinks. A biological tide of incalculable scale, directed by a singular intelligence of a kind that has no real equivalent anywhere else in the setting. That intelligence is called the hive mind. And the hive mind is the place where your understanding of the Tyranids either clicks into place or falls apart entirely, depending on how you think about consciousness. The hive mind is not a creature. It does not have a body, not a single one. Its true body is distributed across entire hive fleets, across billions of individual organisms, across the psychic resonance that those organisms generate collectively. Every single Tyranid creature, from the smallest mindless ripper swarm to the towering biotitans that stride through battle like living cathedrals of violence, every one of them is a cell in a single, impossibly vast organism. They do not think as individuals. They do not have desires or fears or opinions. They are extensions of something larger, the way your hand is not a separate creature from the rest of you, but a part of a larger whole. The will of the hive mind is transmitted through the swarm via what the Imperium calls synapse creatures. Hive tyrants, those towering apex commanders that stand twice the height of a space marine and bristle with weapons grown directly from their own flesh. Tyranid warriors, the mid-tier relay organisms that serve as the communication backbone of any ground invasion. Zoanthropes, the psychic specialists that hover and crackle with energy and channel the hive mind's intent into something like direct psychic fire. These synapse creatures are the nodes of a living network, and within their psychic shadow, the swarm moves with a coordination so absolute it looks mechanical. Thousands of organisms acting as a single fist. The moment those synapse creatures die, something chilling happens. The lesser organisms that depended on them for direction do not simply stop functioning. They revert. They go feral. Termagants and hormagaunts, the expendable foot soldiers of the swarm, the little scurrying nightmares that arrive in numbers that can block out the sky, they dissolve back into animal instinct. Some attack anything moving, some scatter. The great coordinated intelligence collapses into chaos, and for a brief and desperate moment, defenders have a window. That window is almost never wide enough, because the hive mind learns. This is the feature of the Tyranids that sits at the core of why they are genuinely terrifying as a threat, not just for a single battle or a single war, but as an existential problem for every living thing in the galaxy. The hive mind studies every engagement it fights. When a weapon proves effective against the swarm, when a tactic works, when a particular bioform is vulnerable to a particular kind of damage, that information flows back through the psychic network to the Norn Queens, deep in the hive fleet. And the next generation of creatures that comes out of those organisms is built differently, resistant in new ways. Adapted to overcome the specific obstacle that cost the last wave its life, the Norn Queens are the biological architects of the swarm, and they deserve more attention than they usually get. They are massive creatures, living deep within the largest hive ships, surrounded by the most heavily defended areas the fleet can provide. They are, in the most fundamental sense, the source of all Tyranid life. Every single bioform in any given hive fleet was produced by a Norn queen through a process of asexual reproduction that is more like rapid genetic engineering than anything you might think of as birth. The Norn queen ingests genetic material, raw biomass, pumped up from the reclamation pools of consumed worlds, and from that raw material, she synthesizes new creatures, new forms, new nightmares, shaped to the specific demands of whatever challenge the hive mind is currently facing. Kill a Norn queen and the fleet cannot reproduce. It can fight with what it has, but it cannot grow. This is why they are protected so fiercely. This is why they are only found at the absolute heart of the largest hive ships. The death of a Norn queen creates a psychic event powerful enough, according to certain Mechanicus records, to temporarily obscure even the light of the Astronomicon. And upon her death, the hive mind triggers what has been called the Hydra effect, where other organisms begin the process of calving new Norn queens, ensuring that the loss of one does not permanently cripple a fleet. Now, the Tyranids do not travel through the warp. This bears repeating, because it is important. The warp is the realm of chaos, the psychic dimension that underlies real space, and the raw matter of chaos offers nothing to the hive mind. No nourishment, no sustenance, just interference and corruption. Tyranid bioforms that come into contact with chaos energy find themselves in a fight they did not evolve to win, and the hive mind, for all its adaptability, has historically given warp-heavy regions a wide berth. There is a reason that Hive Fleet Kronos, one of the more specialized fleets, evolved specifically to counter chaos influence with a biological toolkit oriented toward range destruction that burns out warp presences. The hive mind encountered a problem it could not avoid, so it grew a fleet specifically designed to solve that problem. Instead of the warp, Tyranid fleets travel through real space, manipulating gravitational fields through those specialized organisms called narwhals. The narwhal is not a weapon or a transport in the conventional sense. It is a living FTL drive, a creature that has evolved or been engineered to bend the physics of local space around a fleet, pushing them faster than light without ever touching the warp. It is slower than true warp travel. It is far less flexible. But it is vastly more reliable. It cannot be disrupted by warp storms, it cannot be sabotaged by demonic interference, and it does not leave your fleet vulnerable to the horrifying things that lurk in the immaterium. The practical consequence of this is that Tyranid fleets approach target systems from real space, and they do so along trajectories that have been calculated over enormous spans of time. They do not simply charge. They navigate. They think three-dimensionally in ways that continue to surprise Imperial commanders who assumed the swarm was incapable of genuine strategic planning. And then there is the shadow in the warp, which is the part of the Tyranid presence that affects everyone else, even before the swarm arrives in force. The hive mind, despite not residing in the warp, has an enormous psychic presence that manifests in the immaterium like a roar, drowning out all other sound. As a hive fleet approaches a target system, this psychic interference expands ahead of it, blanketing entire sectors in a smothering static that disrupts every form of psychic communication. Astropaths, the psychic relay specialists that the Imperium depends on for any communication faster than a physical ship, they cannot function. Navigators, the mutated humans who guide ships through the warp, they go blind to the Astronomicon beacon. Even demons, the predators of the immaterium itself, recoil from the weight of it. A world enveloped by the shadow in the warp falls silent. The Imperium learns of its death not from a distress call, not from any final transmission, but from the silence. A world that has stopped speaking is a world that has fallen, and by the time that silence is registered and acted upon, it is already far too late. The hive mind does not announce its arrival. It does not send diplomats or ultimatums. It simply approaches, its shadow racing ahead of it, and then the sky fills with organisms, and then there is nothing left. This is what the Tyranids are. Not an enemy that can be negotiated with or appeased or deterred by threat of mutual destruction. Not a civilization that can be shown the benefits of coexistence. A hunger, a will, a tide. The question of what such a thing might be fleeing from is the kind of question that, once you ask it seriously, does not let you sleep easily. Part 2. the hive mind in motion biology, adaptation, and purpose. To go deeper into why the Tyranids came here, you first have to understand how they function as a living system, because the biology of the Tyranids is inseparable from their strategic behavior. They are not a military force that happens to use biological weapons. They are biology as a military force, an entire evolutionary process, weaponized and directed by a single controlling intelligence toward the goal of consuming everything. Every organism in a Tyranid swarm has a function, and nothing in the swarm is wasted. The smallest ripper, a barely conscious creature about the size of a large dog, exists to strip the last remaining biomass from a battlefield once the main swarm has moved on, dissolving flesh and plant matter and anything organic into a nutrient slurry that gets pumped back up to the hive ships above. Larger hormagaunts exist to flood enemy positions in waves, to absorb fire, to overwhelm firepower through sheer numbers and psychic coordination. Termagants carry symbiotic weapons, grown into their own bodies, living guns that fire, living ammunition, beetles and spines and acid-filled organisms that burrow or burn or dissolve. Tyranid warriors relay the hive mind's will down to the smaller creatures around them. Carnifexes are living siege engines, heavy armor-cracking organisms the size of tanks, bred for nothing except smashing through fortified positions and shrugging off weapons that would annihilate a lesser creature. Lictors deserve a special mention because they represent something that many people overlook about Tyranid strategy. Before the main swarm arrives, before the shadow in the warp fully descends, lictors are already there. These are solitary scout organisms, chameleonic, able to blend into their environment with biological camouflage that borders on psychic. A lictor precedes the swarm onto a target world by weeks or months, creeping through its wilderness and cities and fortifications, learning the genetic signature of potential prey, marking targets, testing defenses, feeding information back to the hive mind. By the time the first spore pods fall from orbit and the sky starts to darken with incoming organisms, the hive mind already knows the planet. It knows where the defenders are weakest. It knows what adaptations it needs to deploy. It has done its homework. Then there is the Swarm Lord, the single most unique organism in the entire Tyranid catalog of horrors. The Swarm Lord is not a standard bioform. It is a specific, deliberate creation of the hive mind, called into being only when conventional Tyranid strategies have failed against a particularly challenging opponent. It is the pinnacle of what a hive tyrant can be, but it is categorically more than that. It wields 4 bone sabers, whose cores contain crystalline growths from outside the galaxy, materials that are not native to the Milky Way at all. Its tactical intelligence is something that the hive mind normally suppresses in its instruments, because intelligence in a subordinate creates inefficiencies. The Swarm Lord is the exception. It is given autonomy that no other Tyranid creature receives, because it needs that autonomy to think in ways the rigid structure of the swarm cannot. The truly disturbing detail about the Swarm Lord is what happens when it dies. Other Tyranid organisms, when killed, are recycled. Their genetic material is reclaimed, if possible, and their place in the swarm is filled by the next organism. The Swarm Lord is different. When it is destroyed, the hive mind absorbs every experience that Swarm Lord had during its existence, every tactical lesson learned, every moment of combat data, and it uses that accumulated knowledge to build a new Swarm Lord, not a replacement, a continuation. The same consciousness, with the same memories, brought back with the benefit of whatever knowledge its death taught the swarm. The Swarm Lord has been dying and being reborn across the entire history of the Tyranid race. It is, in the most genuinely unsettling sense, as old as the species itself. It has been fighting, learning, dying, and returning for longer than most civilizations in the galaxy have existed. When it has walked the battlefields of the 41st millennium, it is bringing with it millions of years of tactical memory. The weapons the swarm deploys are as strange as the organisms carrying them. Venom cannons and death spitters and barbed stranglers are all biological organs or creatures symbiotic to the warriors carrying them, generating or firing organic ammunition. Biovores are artillery organisms that lob spore mines across the battlefield, floating gas bladder creatures that detonate on contact, releasing acid or toxins or bioelectric discharge. The hive mind has a biological answer to every threat it has encountered, and more importantly, It keeps refining those answers every time it fights. This is why every victory against the Tyranids carries a shadow. Defeating them teaches them. The Battle of Macragge, where Hive Fleet Behemoth was shattered, taught the Hive Mind about Ultramarines' tactics, about orbital warfare, about the specific vulnerabilities of individual Space Marine gene lines. That knowledge was absorbed. When Hive Fleet Kraken arrived, it was different, more cunning, attacking in multiple tendrils rather than one overwhelming mass, adapted to overcome the lessons Behemoth had already provided. When Leviathan arrived, it was different again, attacking from below the galactic plane, where no threat had ever come from before, using pincer formation tactics that could theoretically isolate Terra itself. Each fleet that has arrived has been demonstrably more sophisticated than the last, and the lore repeatedly hints that what we have seen so far, as devastating as it has been, represents only a fraction of the total Tyranid presence. The Hive fleets that have torn through Imperial space and driven entire chapters of Space Marines to near extinction, that reduced the paradise world of Prandium to a dead rock and almost consumed the Blood Angels on their own homeworld of Baal. Those are, by multiple accounts, advanced fleets, scouts. The main body is still out there. Spend time with that. The organisms that have caused 4 tyrannic wars, that have consumed countless worlds, that have forced every faction in the galaxy to at least partly divert attention from their other wars to deal with the advancing swarms. Those are the scouts. The advance guard. The probing tendrils sent ahead to test the defenses of the galaxy before the real weight of the Great Devourer arrives. If that is true, then nothing the galaxy has so far experienced constitutes the actual Tyranid threat. It constitutes the warning. Part 3. The night the galaxy was noticed. Here is a thing that most people, even people who know the Tyranids fairly well, do not fully reckon with. The reason the Tyranids came here is not because the Milky Way was the nearest galaxy, or the richest in biomass, or the most convenient target for the hive mind's next meal. The reason the Tyranids came here is because of a specific event, a single moment in the Horus Heresy, roughly 10,000 years before the current 41st millennium, when a desperate act of sacrifice by a dying warrior lit up a beacon visible across the intergalactic void. The story starts on a world called Sotha during the time of Imperium Secundus. Understand first what the Horus Heresy was doing to the galaxy at this point. The War Master Horus had turned against the Emperor. Half the Space Marine legions had declared for the traitors. A vast warp storm called the Ruin Storm had been deliberately conjured by the Word-Bearer's traitor legion during the Battle of Calth, a storm so vast it divided the galaxy and cut off entire swaths of loyal forces from Terra and from each other. Primarch Raboot Guilliman of the Ultramarines, finding himself unable to determine whether Terra still stood, unable to contact the Emperor, unable to even know if the Imperium he had spent his life building still existed, made a difficult decision. He established Imperium Secundus, a fallback empire centered on Ultramar, to preserve at least something of what they were fighting for. But Imperium Secundus could not function without communication. Without a way to guide ships through the warp and coordinate with the scattered loyalist forces across those 500 worlds, it would collapse inward from isolation. And the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon on Terra that normally served this function, was unreachable through the Ruin Storm. Then they found the Pharos. Buried beneath Mount Pharos on the world of Sotha was a device of extraordinary age and extraordinary purpose. A pre-human artifact, constructed, as was eventually determined, by the Necrons during their ancient dominion over the galaxy. The Pharos was not a psychic device. It worked through what has been described as empathic energy, quantum entanglement, at a scale that makes the concept almost meaningless to human minds, and it could serve as a navigational beacon visible through the warp, without drawing on psychic power at all. Through the Ruin Storm, the Pharos could reach where the Astronomicon could not. Guilliman used it. It was Xenos technology, something deeply uncomfortable to a legion built on reason and order. But he used it because the alternative was darkness and dissolution. The Night Lords found out. And they came for the Pharos because they saw its value as a weapon, as a tool for finding their Primarch, Conrad Kurz, who had gone to ground somewhere in Ultramar. The Battle of Sotha was the result. Loyalist forces defending the mountain, Night Lords attacking with the kind of terrifying precision their legion was known for. At the turning point of that battle, a warrior named Barabbas Dantioch, an Iron Warrior's warpsmith who had defected to the Loyalists when his own Primarch betrayed the Emperor, made a choice. The Night Lords were going to take the Pharos. There was no stopping that. So he did the only thing left to do. He overloaded it. The explosion of psychic and empathic energy that resulted was massive enough to scatter the Night Lord's fleet. It was a victory. Dantioch died in the process, but the battle was won and the traitors were turned back. What no one at Sotha could have known, because no one at Sotha had any way of knowing, was what that pulse looked like from outside the galaxy. From the intergalactic void, that moment was equivalent to lighting an enormous fire in a pitch-black landscape. Something out there in the darkness, dormant, drifting, burning through the cold void between galaxies, in the long sleep between feedings, something noticed. Sensor organisms in a vast fleet of dormant Tyranid bioships registered the blast. The information propagated through a network of sleeping creatures, beginning the slow process of waking them to examine what they had detected. When they fully processed what the signal meant, that it indicated not just energy but a direction, a source, something worth investigating, the fleet adjusted its course. It began moving toward the Milky Way. This is not a fan theory. This is the confirmed lore, as established in the epilogue of the Horus Heresy novel Pharos by Guy Haley, and confirmed in the wider 40K canon. The first Hive fleet to enter the galaxy, what the Imperium eventually designated Hive Fleet Behemoth, arrived roughly 9,740 years after the Battle of Sotha. If you assume the fleet was approximately 100,000 light-years from the Milky Way when it detected the signal, the math works out reasonably well given the FTL travel speed a fleet manipulating gravity fields could achieve. They were in the void between galaxies, in the dark, drifting, and a single moment of desperate sacrifice in a battle that no one outside Ultramar even knew was happening, woke them up and pointed them at us. Think about that chain of causation. The Word-bearers conjured the Ruin Storm to isolate Ultramar. Guilliman used an alien device to compensate. Night Lords attacked to steal that device. Dantioch destroyed it rather than let them have it. The Tyranids noticed the destruction. 10,000 years later, the first tyrannic war begins. Every tyrannic war, every world consumed, every Space Marine chapter reduced to a fraction of its strength, every civilization ground to dust under the advance of the Great Devourer. All of it traces back to a desperate act in a battle during a civil war that happened before the current age of the setting even began. The galaxy called to the Tyranids, not deliberately, not consciously, but it called, and they answered, and now here we are. But the Pharos was not the only beacon. It may not even have been the most important one in the long run. Part 4. The Emperor's Lighthouse and the Dinner Bell Theory. There is a second way that humanity may have been advertising its presence to the Tyranids, one that predates the Battle of Sotha and continues to do so to this day, one that pulses constantly, one that cannot be turned off without catastrophic consequences to the entire Imperium, one that sits at the center of Terra itself, the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon that makes the Imperium possible. Without it, void ship travel through the warp becomes a matter of guesswork and horror. Navigators, those mutated humans with the third eye that allows them to perceive the warp, use the Astronomicon as a fixed point of reference, a psychic lighthouse that allows them to orient within the shifting, non-Euclidean madness of the Immaterium. It radiates from Terra, powered originally by the Emperor's own immense psychic mind, and after his interment on the Golden Throne, powered by the sacrifice of 10,000 psychers who burned themselves out, sustaining it, dying at a rate of roughly 100 per day. Its range is approximately 50,000 light-years, meaning it does not reach the entire galaxy. The regions beyond that range, deep in the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium beyond the Great Rift, those regions are cut off from reliable warp navigation in ways that have become catastrophic since the 41st millennium fractured. But, within its range, the Astronomicon is a constant, blazing psychic presence, visible from an extraordinary distance, visible, potentially, from outside the galaxy. The canonical lore states directly that the Astronomicon is believed to be what draws the Tyranid hive fleets toward the Milky Way. That the psychic light of the beacon, the signal born of the Emperor's dying will, and the sacrifice of thousands of psychers, serves as a lure that the hive mind cannot ignore. In the same way that the Pharos overload rang like a dinner bell across the intergalactic void, the Astronomicon sings continuously, broadcasting the presence of psychic life at a scale that makes the galaxy detectable from enormous distances. There is a bitter irony here so perfectly calibrated to the tone of Warhammer 40K that it feels almost deliberate from a storytelling standpoint. The Imperium of Man, in building the device that makes its civilization possible, in creating the beacon that guides its million ships through the terrors of the warp, may have been announcing its existence to the worst predator in the universe for 10,000 years. The lighthouse that keeps the ships safe may be the lighthouse that drew the monsters to the coast. Humanity's great achievement, humanity's greatest vulnerability. That is a very 40K kind of tragedy. And there is an additional layer to this that is even stranger. The Emperor himself, in his current state, barely alive on the Golden Throne, his body, sustained by mechanisms and sacrifice and sheer psychic willpower, radiates a psychic presence that dwarfs the Astronomicon. He is, at this point, an entity of pure psychic energy contained within a dying physical form, and the energy he projects is visible in the warp across almost unimaginable distances. The hive mind, with its own deep psychic nature and its endless hunger for biological matter, may perceive the Emperor not merely as a navigational hazard or a signal to avoid, but as a target. The single greatest concentration of psychic energy in the galaxy, sitting in a city of billions, on the most densely populated world in the Imperium. Hive Fleet Leviathan's current trajectory, as confirmed in 10th edition lore, has multiple tendrils pointed in directions that, extrapolated forward, converge on Segmentum Solar. Terra lies in that path. Whether this is coincidence or the hive mind's specific intent is not clear, but Imperial analysts in the current lore are not treating it as a coincidence. If the Emperor is a beacon as much as the Astronomicon, then the Tyranids are not just responding to a signal. They are closing in on the source. And the source is the thing that keeps the Imperium alive. Destroy the Astronomicon, or sufficiently disrupt it, and the Imperium fractures. The Great Rift already demonstrated what happens when it goes dark, even briefly. The Days of Blindness, that period after the formation of the Great Rift, when the Astronomicon went out for varying periods across different regions, caused unrest and horror on a scale that sent shockwaves through the Imperium's vast administrative structure. The prospect of it going out permanently, or of Terra itself being consumed, is a scenario that the setting has been building toward in a slow, geological way for years. It is the unspoken endpoint that all of the current lore is arranged around. But none of this explains why the Tyranids came from outside the galaxy. Both the Pharos and the Astronomicon explain why the Tyranids came toward the Milky Way. They explain the direction and the destination. Neither of them explains why the Tyranids were in the intergalactic void in the first place. Why were they out there? Why were they drifting in the dark between galaxies, rather than happily consuming the galaxy they were previously in? This is where the theories start to diverge, and where the conversation gets genuinely interesting. Part 5. The math of hunger. Did they simply eat everything? The simplest explanation is often the right one. And the simplest explanation for why the Tyranids were drifting through the intergalactic void when the Pharos signal reached them is that they had already finished with wherever they were before. They ate it. Every world. Every star system with biological matter worth consuming. Every civilization, every creature, every microbe in every soil sample. They stripped it all to bare rock and moved on, because that is what the hive mind does. It does not rest. It does not establish territories or maintain populations of prey for sustainable long-term use. It consumes entirely, utterly, completely, and then it moves on in search of the next meal. Some sources in the 40K lore suggest the Tyranids have consumed other galaxies. The Lexicanum notes a claim from one source that they have consumed roughly 1,000 galaxies, though this is acknowledged to be uncertain. The Tyranids fandom wiki notes that each of the major hive fleets has approached the Milky Way from a different direction, something that is more consistent with fleets originating from multiple already consumed galaxies across the local group than with a single point of origin. The local group of galaxies, the loose cluster that includes the Milky Way, Andromeda, the Magellanic Clouds, and dozens of smaller galaxies, may already be partially or largely stripped of any other biology. The Tyranids may have been working through the neighborhood for a very long time before the Pharaohs gave them a new direction. The math supports this in its own rough way. If you take the established timeline that the Battle of Sotha happened in approximately M31 and Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived in M41, you get roughly 10,000 years of travel time. If the fleet was moving at around 10 times the speed of light during that journey, they would have covered approximately 100,000 light-years. This is significant because 100,000 light-years is roughly the diameter of the Milky Way itself. The fleet detected us from outside our own galaxy, at a distance comparable to the width of the galaxy they were headed toward. They were not in the Milky Way. They were in the intergalactic void, drifting. Why were they in the void? There are a few scenarios. Maybe they were in transit between galaxies. Maybe the last galaxy they consumed was nearby, within the local group, and the Pharaoh signal gave them a new heading. The Magellanic Clouds, the two small satellite galaxies of the Milky Way, are only a few 100,000 light-years away. If the Tyranids were in the process of consuming those smaller galaxies, or had recently finished with them, a signal from the Milky Way would have been detected at relatively short range on a cosmic scale. There is a grim possibility here that the setting nods toward without fully committing to. The various hive fleets arrive from different directions. Behemoth from the galactic east, Kraken from multiple directions at once, attacking in tendrils, Leviathan from below the galactic plane. If the Tyranids were coming from a single direction, from a single point of origin, you would expect a more uniform approach. The fact that they come from different angles suggests multiple fleets originating from different positions, not a single fleet from a single galaxy. In other words, the local group may already belong to the Tyranids. The other galaxies in our neighborhood may already be dead. The Milky Way may be the last inhabited galaxy in our immediate cosmic vicinity, and the swarms are converging on it from all directions because they have already consumed everything else within reach. The pure hunger theory, the idea that the Tyranids came here because they simply exhausted everywhere else, has a specific kind of horror to it. There is no villain in this scenario. There is no mastermind plotting conquest. There is no motive beyond the most primal biological drive. They are hungry. They were always hungry, and we happen to glow in the dark. The fact that what we are witnessing in the current timeline, the Fourth Tyrannic War, the multiple tendrils of Leviathan threatening multiple sectors simultaneously, represents what the lore repeatedly describes as only an advance force, makes the hunger theory existentially overwhelming. If this is a fraction of the total swarm, the fraction that was sent ahead while the main body continues its approach, then the full weight of the hunger bearing down on the galaxy is beyond meaningful quantification. The galaxy has survived the Tyranids so far, at enormous cost. Whether it can survive the full arrival of the Great Devourer is a question that, within the fiction, nobody can answer with any honesty. The tyrannic scholars of the Ordo Xenos do not answer it with hope. But the hunger theory, satisfying as it is in its bleak simplicity, does not account for everything, because there is another reading of the evidence, one that suggests the Tyranids did not simply run out of food, one that suggests they left because something drove them out. Part 6, Something in the Dark, the Predator Fleeing Theory. Now we get to the part that the lore whispers about, rather than stating directly. The theory that has haunted 40K fan discussions for decades, the idea that makes the Tyranids not the top of the food chain, but something terrified of what is above them. The theory is this: something in the extragalactic void, or in the galaxy or galaxies the Tyranids came from, beat them. Not in the sense of a military defeat, though perhaps that too, but in a more fundamental sense. Something exists out there that the hive mind recognized as a threat it could not overcome. Something that made the hive mind do the closest thing to running away that an organism of its nature is capable of, which is to cross the void between galaxies in a desperate search for somewhere to go that is not where it was. This theory does not have explicit canonical confirmation. It is not a named entity in any official lore source. No Games Workshop publication has yet said, "Here is the creature or force that the Tyranids fear. Here is the thing that drove them across the intergalactic void." The closest the official lore comes is in the works of certain Ordo Xenos scholars within the fiction, who note the possibility in muted, almost careful tones, as if the act of voicing the thought might draw attention to itself. But the circumstantial case is worth examining. Consider the approach vectors. The hive fleets come from different directions. If the Tyranids were simply expanding outward from a point of origin, as you would expect from a species driven purely by hunger, following the nearest available food source, the directions of approach would cluster around whatever direction that expansion pointed. Instead, they surround the Milky Way in a way that could suggest they are converging on it from all available angles, the way animals converge on the only source of water during a drought. Something has driven them toward this specific galaxy from multiple directions simultaneously. Consider the urgency. The hive mind, in the current era, is pressing harder and faster than its previous invasions would suggest is necessary. Hive Fleet Leviathan is not behaving like a predator following a comfortable food trail. It is behaving like something that is on a schedule. The Fourth Tyrannic War represents an escalation in both the number of tendrils and the strategic sophistication of the approach that goes beyond merely adapting to previous defeats. It feels, to use a word carefully in this context, desperate. Consider the behavior of the earliest detected Tyranid presence in the galaxy. Genstealers, the vanguard infiltration organisms, were detected in certain parts of the galaxy far earlier than the major hive fleets arrived. Some may have arrived as early as M35 or M36, seated by a fleet-designated hive fleet Tiamat that appears to have a specific and unusual relationship with a particular star system. The Tiamat system is one that the Tyranids have invaded and consumed, and then, unusually, left guarded rather than abandoned. There is something in the Tiamat system that the hive mind considers worth protecting. What that is, the lore has not fully answered. But the behavior is distinct from normal Tyranid operation, and distinct behaviors suggest distinct purposes. Now let us consider the chaos theory, because several analysts within the fan community, and there are hints of it in the official material, have proposed chaos itself as what the Tyranids might be fleeing. The ruinous powers are not confined to the Milky Way. The warp underlies all of reality. Every galaxy, every star system, the entire material universe exists alongside and interpenetrating with the psychic dimension of the warp. If chaos is active in extragalactic space, if the forces of the dark gods have been waging war in the spaces the Tyranids came from, it is possible that the Tyranids encountered a chaos presence powerful enough to threaten even the hive mind. The problem with this theory is that the Tyranids and chaos have a complicated relationship even within the Milky Way. They are not natural allies, but they are also not straightforwardly opposed. The raw matter of chaos cannot nourish the Tyranids, but the Tyranid's shadow in the warp has been noted to disturb even demonic entities. The two forces seem to operate on such different principles that they are more like incompatible natural phenomena than like enemies who actively seek each other's destruction. A galaxy dominated by chaos would, in theory, be largely indigestible to the Tyranids, which might indeed prompt them to seek a different feeding ground rather than fight an unwinnable battle. There is also the possibility that whatever drove the Tyranids here is something entirely without precedent, something the 40K universe has not yet named or characterized. The setting is careful about this. It maintains the mystery deliberately, because the horror of the not knowing serves the fiction better than any specific monster the lore team could invent. The suggestion of a threat so severe that the Great Devourer itself fled from it is maximally terrifying, precisely because it remains undefined. The moment you give it a name and a shape, it becomes something comprehensible, something that can be placed in a hierarchy of power and understood. The unknowable cannot be placed in a hierarchy. It just is. If we accept the possibility that something is behind the Tyranids, or that something drove them here, then the current situation becomes not a story about the greatest predator in the universe attacking the galaxy, but a story about the greatest predator in the galaxy being used as a battering ram. The Milky Way's defenders are fighting the Tyranids. The Tyranids may be fleeing something worse, and whatever that worse thing is, it has not yet shown itself. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but maybe there is also the shadow of something that even the war does not account for. Part 7. The hive fleets arrive, a history of consumption. Let us now walk through what the arrival of the Tyranids has actually looked like in practice, because the abstract scale of the threat only becomes comprehensible when you look at the specific engagements the specific worlds consumed, the specific moments when the galaxy realized what was coming. The Imperium's first confirmed contact with a full Tyranid hive fleet happened in 745 M41 at a small Adeptus Mechanicus research station on Tyran Primus. The Mechanicus adepts stationed there noticed something strange happening to nearby systems. Worlds that had been cataloged with various forms of life were silent. When survey ships investigated, they found those worlds stripped to bare rock, no atmosphere, no microbes, no trace of the biological richness that had previously been there, just silent stone. Magos Varnak, who was stationed on Tyran, recognized that whatever was doing this was coming. He began gathering information on the approaching organisms, cataloging what his instruments could detect of the incoming fleet, and when it became clear that Tyran itself was in the path of this thing and that escape was impossible, he hid his data codex in a bore shaft 3,000 meters below the surface. He wanted someone to know. He wanted the information to survive even if he could not. The Tyranids came and took the world in what was, by any standard, an almost obscenely short time. The entire population and garrison of Tyran were dead within 24 hours. The planet was stripped of all organic material and left as a bare rock. Inquisitor Fetus Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos arrived after the fact. He found the devastated world, he found Varnak's hidden data codex, and he began the desperate race to warn the Imperium of what was coming. The Hive Fleet, which was already moving toward the next target, already reaching out toward the gem of Ultramar, was now designated Hive Fleet Behemoth. The name came from Tyran, the planet where the Imperium first understood what it was dealing with. The Tyranids were named for Tyran, and Tyran itself was already a memory. Behemoth moved like a single, overwhelming mass, a direct assault without subtlety or complexity. It consumed worlds in its path with the same casual completeness that a tide consumes a beach, and it was pointed at Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, made the decision to stand and defend his home, to break Behemoth at Macragge or die in the attempt. The Battle of Macragge was the defining engagement of the First Tyrannic War and one of the most costly victories in the history of the Space Marines. The Ultramarines fortified the planet, deployed their fleet to contest the Hive Fleet in orbit, and brought everything they had to bear against the consuming mass of Behemoth. They won, barely. The Ultramarines' entire first company, the veterans in Terminator armor who made the final stand at the Polar Fortress, died to the last man. Calgar himself was crippled so severely that most of his physical body had to be rebuilt. The world itself was left scarred and infested with splinter elements that took years to fully purge. The victory was real, but so was the cost. And even as the Imperium was absorbing the lesson of Macragge, even as its leaders were allowing themselves to believe the worst was behind them, the scattered remnants of Behemoth were regrouping. And 250 years later, a second fleet arrived. Hive Fleet Kraken was different, in a way that demonstrated with horrible clarity that the hive mind had learned from Behemoth's defeat. Where Behemoth had been a battering ram, a single overwhelming mass that could be contested and broken in a decisive engagement, Kraken was something more like a disease. It did not advance as a single entity. It fragmented into hundreds of smaller tendrils, each one a separate strike force, attacking simultaneously across an enormous front. The eastern fringe erupted in dozens of places at once. Imperial forces could not concentrate against a single point, because there was no single point. Every response to one tendril left other positions exposed. Every defensive success in one location simply meant that the resources spent there were unavailable somewhere else. Among the casualties of Hive Fleet Kraken was the craft world of Iyanden, one of the largest surviving Aeldari craft worlds. Iyanden was struck with such force that it was nearly annihilated. The entire craft world mobilized for battle, every Aeldari who could fight taking up arms, and they still came within moments of being overwhelmed. Prince Uriel, previously exiled from Iyanden for excessive arrogance, returned with his Corsair fleet and slew the Hive Tyrant, directing the assault, breaking the attack's coordination. Iyanden survived, but the price was catastrophic. To this day, centuries later, the craft world fights more with wraith constructs than with living warriors, because so many of its people died fighting the swarm that there simply are not enough living Eldari left to fill the ranks. The dead fight for Iyanden because the living are too few. Kraken was eventually broken at the Imperial world of Ikar IV by a combination of Ultramarines, Imperial Guard, and, notably, an Eldari force that joined the battle with interests of their own. But broken is not destroyed. Kraken's scattered splinters continued to haunt the eastern fringe for generations after the main fleet was nominally defeated. They are still there. Then, less than 5 years after Kraken was broken, Inquisitor Kryptman detected the signs of a third fleet, a fleet that would make everything that had come before look like a prologue. Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived in 997 M41, and it was notable for what it was not doing. It was not approaching from the eastern fringe, where all previous major threats had come from. It was not approaching from any direction that Imperial defenses were oriented toward. It was rising from below the galactic plane, attacking from beneath, in a pincer formation designed to cut off enormous sections of the galaxy from each other and from Terra. One of Leviathan's initial tendrils was pointed directly at the segmentum solar, directly at Terra. The scale of Leviathan was unlike anything the galaxy had faced from the Tyranids before. Inquisitor Kryptman's response was equally unprecedented. Recognizing that conventional defenses could not stop a fleet of this size, he ordered exterminatus upon a series of worlds in the fleet's path, deliberately stripping them of biomass so that Leviathan could not feed and grow during its advance. The human cost of this decision was staggering. The Inquisition eventually excommunicated Kryptman for it, declaring his actions beyond acceptable parameters. Kryptman responded to this by executing what might be his most audacious gambit. He captured a brood of Genostealers and deliberately seeded them into Orc-controlled space, into the Octarius system, one of the most densely populated Orc territories in the galaxy. The resulting conflict, the Octarius War, drew Leviathan into a sustained battle with the Orcs that occupied a massive portion of the fleet's strength for years. The plan was to let the two most aggressive and adaptable species in the galaxy tear each other apart, weakening both. The problem with this plan is that Orcs and Tyranids both become stronger through conflict. The Orcs fight harder and more furiously when they have a worthy opponent. The Tyranids adapt and evolve in response to each battle, absorbing the genetic material of everything they consume, including Orc biomass. The Octarius War has resulted in something genuinely terrible. Orc organisms that have fought Tyranids long enough to absorb some of their combat instincts, and Tyranid organisms that have absorbed the genetic material of Orcs and grown proportionally more resilient and aggressive. The war ground on, both sides escalating, both sides growing from the conflict, and the end result was a nightmare that dwarfed either original threat. The Battle of Baal, in the early era Indomitus, saw a massive tendril of Leviathan converge on the Blood Angels' home system. The Blood Angels called in every successor chapter, the entire Sanguinary Brotherhood, to defend Baal and its moons. The battle was brutal enough that the outcome was in genuine doubt until two things happened simultaneously. The Great Rift tore open, and the warp storms generated by that event consumed portions of the Leviathan fleet in orbit, and the Daemons of Khorne, under the bloodthirster Kabanda, turned their considerable violence on the Tyranids on the ground, apparently more interested in that particular fight than in continuing their ancient grudge with the Blood Angels. Leviathan's tendril at Baal was broken, but Leviathan itself was far from finished. The Fourth Tyrannic War represents the current state of the conflict, and it is the subject of the 10th edition Warhammer 40K narrative framework. 3 new tendrils of Leviathan, designated Grandillus, Nautilon, and Promothor, are attacking the Segmentum Pacificus from both above and below the galactic plane, threatening to isolate Imperial forces in the west, while the eastern fringe continues to deal with splinter fleets from previous invasions. The Bastior subsector has become the focal point of the fighting, and the Imperium's response includes the Soulblade Strike Forces, a collection of Space Marine and Astra Militarum forces under high command coordination, tasked with blunting each tendril before the others can exploit the distraction. The lore notes, with the kind of quiet dread that 40K does so well, that some of the worlds in the current war zone are contested so intensely that the sky itself is blocked out by Tyranid bioforms. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of what happens when the full weight of a hive fleet's aerial organisms, gargoyles and harpies, and things that do not yet have names in imperial taxonomy, descend on a system in sufficient numbers to physically darken the sky. Worlds where the sun does not rise, because the creatures between it and the surface are too numerous. And this is still just the advance fleet. This is still just the scouts. Part 8. The long game before the storm. Gene Stealers and the Vanguard of Betrayal. One of the most unsettling things about Tyranid strategy is how patient it is. The main swarm is not patient, exactly, but the vanguard organisms that precede it, particularly the Gene Stealers, operate on timescales that seem almost incomprehensible for a creature that appears to be nothing more than a clawed predator. A single Gene Stealer, arriving on a world through some stowaway means, carried in the hold of a cargo ship, or lurking in a space hulk that passed close enough to transfer organisms, is the beginning of a catastrophe that might take 300 years to fully mature. It does not attack immediately. It hides, it watches, it waits for an opportunity to find a suitable host. The Gene Stealer's reproductive method is called the kiss, and calling it a kiss is doing a great deal of work to make something genuinely horrible sound slightly less horrible. The Genestealer pins a host organism and inserts an ovipositor, a tube-like appendage, deep into the host's body, injecting embryonic organisms containing the Genestealer's genetic material. The host survives this. The host may not even clearly remember it, the interaction carrying a psychic component that produces a kind of dazed compliance. And in the following weeks and months, the host's genetic code is quietly rewritten. Their couplorations, their consciousness is suppressed and replaced by a psychic connection to something larger. And when the host has children, those children are not entirely human. First-generation hybrids are visibly alien, multiple limbs, chitinous growths, features that are recognizably Genestealer, but also recognizably humanoid in the way a nightmare is recognizable while being wrong. These hybrids are hidden, kept in the deep warrens and shadows of whatever society the cult is embedded in. Second generation is more human, but still obviously inhuman. Third generation, closer still. Fourth generation hybrids can pass for human, with minor abnormalities that can be concealed or explained away. And the fourth generation can produce fifth generation children who are, once again, full pure strains. The cycle refreshes. New Genestealers emerge from a completely human-looking population, capable of going out and beginning the process again on new worlds. The entire cult is held together by the brood mind, a localized psychic echo of the hive mind that connects every infected individual to the patriarch, the original Gene Stealer who started the infection, who has by now grown immense and psychically powerful through generations of devotion and genetic feedback. The cult worships the patriarch as a god. It worships the coming of the hive fleet as a divine event, calling the ships that will destroy every member of the cult along with everyone else, the Star Children, the Redeemers, the salvation that has been promised across generations. They do not know that the Tyranids will consume them too. The cult's psychic beacon, built from the collective devotion of hundreds of thousands of infected individuals, reaches across space and draws the fleet closer. When the shadow in the warp falls and the fleet arrives, the cult rises in violent insurrection, its long preparations complete, its generations of infiltration culminating in a simultaneous uprising that cripples planetary defense networks, assassinates commanders, and sabotages infrastructure from within at the exact moment the orbital assault begins. The planet is already broken before the first spore pod falls, and the cultists themselves are consumed alongside everyone else. There is something specifically tragic about this if you allow yourself to sit with it for a moment. Generations of human beings, corrupted through no fault of their own, living under an infection they did not choose, building a devotion to an idea of salvation that is actually their destruction. The cult promises relief from the grinding misery of imperial life, from the poverty and oppression and endless labor that defines existence for most people in the 40K universe. It offers community, purpose, something to believe in, and everything it offers is a lie, not even a deliberately cruel lie, because the hive mind does not understand deception in the way a person does. The cult is simply an effective biological weapon that happens to exploit human needs for meaning and belonging. The tragedy is incidental to the mechanism. The earliest detected Genestealer presence in the Milky Way predates the official first contact with Hive Fleet Behemoth by many centuries. The moons of Ymgarl, where what were then thought to be a native alien species called Ymgarl genestealers were discovered, have been retrospectively identified as very early vanguard organisms. Significant in this context is the connection to Hive Fleet Tiamat, one of the more mysterious fleets in the lore. The Tiamat system, unlike the targets of other Hive fleets, appears to be a location the Tyranids have specifically protected and maintained rather than stripped and abandoned. Something about Tiamat is important to the hive mind in a way that goes beyond normal feeding behavior. What it is remains one of the genuine open mysteries of the current era. The pattern of genestealer infestation across the galaxy, taken as a whole, reveals the scale of the preparation the hive mind has been conducting for tens of thousands of years. By the current era, genestealer cults have been discovered on worlds throughout the Imperium. Some of these cults have been in place for centuries, quietly growing, quietly waiting. The Imperium's ability to detect and purge them is limited by the very nature of the infiltration, by the fact that fourth-generation hybrids can pass a visual inspection, and the psychic component of the infection is subtle enough to evade most routine screening. For every cult the Deathwatch hunts down and destroys, how many more remain undiscovered in the depths of a billion worlds? The Great Rift, which tore the galaxy in half in the current era, has accelerated this problem enormously. Vast refugee fleets, carrying billions of displaced people across the galaxy, provide ideal transport for genestealer organisms. Security screenings that were already imperfect have become impossible to maintain in the chaos of mass displacement. The infestation that was already widespread is now spreading in ways that are genuinely difficult to quantify. The hive mind is patient in ways that biological instinct does not usually allow. But the hive mind is not acting on instinct. It is acting on something much more deliberate, a strategy that unfolds over centuries, that prepared the Milky Way for invasion long before the invasion began, that seeded the battlefield across the breadth of a galaxy with weapons that look like people. Part 9. The Shadow That Silences Everything. The shadow in the warp deserves its own focused examination, because it is easy to understand it as a tactical capability, a disruption to enemy communications, and miss what it actually represents, what it tells you about the nature of the Tyranids, what it suggests about what the hive mind actually is in a metaphysical sense. The shadow in the warp is generated by the collective psychic presence of the entire hive mind. Every single Tyranid organism, from the largest hive ship to the smallest ripper, contributes to this presence, and the combined effect is a weight in the immaterium so vast that it simply drowns out everything else. Not through interference in the conventional sense, not through jamming a signal with stronger noise, but through presence. The hive mind's psychic mass is so enormous that the warp in the vicinity of a hive fleet becomes the hive mind's warp, shaped by its hunger, saturated with its intent. For psychers who try to use their abilities within the influence of the shadow, the experience is described in a range of ways, all of them terrible. Some describe a sensation of being watched by something impossibly large, something that is not malevolent in any personal sense, but is hungry in a way that encompasses everything, a hunger so vast it feels like a weather pattern rather than a desire. Some describe the chittering of countless insects, a sound that is not quite a sound, that presses against the mind from the inside rather than arriving through the ears. Some describe the feeling of their own thoughts being slowly dismantled, as if the hive mind is examining the contents of their consciousness with the same systematic thoroughness that the swarm examines a prey world, cataloging and consuming. Astropaths, who rely entirely on their psychic gifts to perform their function as the Imperium's interstellar communication network, cannot work within the shadow. The screams in their minds become too loud. Their connection to the Astronomicon, their lifeline and their orientation point, is severed as completely as cutting a rope. Some have been documented breaking their own skulls against walls in their desperation to silence what they hear. Others simply die, their psychic connection overloaded by the alien presence, pressing in from all sides. Navigators, those indispensable mutated navigators of the warp, go blind to the Astronomicon within the shadow. The third eye that allows them to perceive the warp and maintain orientation within it becomes useless, overwhelmed by the psychic static. Ships caught in the shadow during warp transit are forced out into real space, their navigation suddenly impossible, stranded in the vicinity of the incoming fleet, without the ability to call for help or escape. Even those without psychic gifts feel the shadow. It manifests as a generalized dread, a malaise that settles over populations in the path of the fleet weeks before the first genestealer bursts through a wall. Nightmares become universal. The sense of something coming, something enormous and patient and hungry, pressing in from all sides. Entire populations have been documented declining into collective psychosis before the first physical contact with the swarm, as if the knowledge of what is coming, delivered through this indirect psychic pressure, breaks something fundamental in the human capacity for hope. Now consider what this means for the Chaos Gods. The entities of the warp, the daemons, and the intelligences that define the psychic dimension, those are beings of pure energy shaped by emotion and thought. The shadow in the warp is an intrusion of something that seems to consume the warp itself, that the hive mind's presence crowds out and suppresses. Daemons in the vicinity of a hive fleet do not behave with their characteristic aggression and malevolence. They recoil. There are accounts of demonic incursions simply ceasing as a hive fleet approaches, of warp rifts closing, as if the shadow's pressure has sealed them. The Chaos Gods, who feed on the emotions and souls of living creatures, face the prospect of the Tyranids consuming all those creatures and leaving nothing for the warp to feed on. The Tyranids and Chaos are, in a very real sense, competing for the same resource. Every world the Tyranids consume is a world that no longer generates psychic energy for the ruinous powers. Every species the swarm assimilates is a species no longer available for corruption and damnation. If the Tyranids succeed in consuming the Milky Way entirely, the Chaos Gods lose a galaxy's worth of psychic sustenance. The Great Rift, the opening of that massive channel between the warp and real space, may be in part the Chaos Gods' response to this threat, an attempt to consume what can be consumed before the swarm gets to it. There is an argument, made quietly in imperial strategy circles and loudly in certain heretical philosophical traditions, that chaos and the Tyranids are in a race, that the endless wars and heresies and corruption that the ruinous powers generate are not purely about dominion and suffering, but are also about harvesting souls before the great devourer strips everything down to bare rock. In this reading, the tragedy of the 41st millennium is a competition between two forms of annihilation for the right to be the thing that ends everything. The shadow in the warp is the Tyranid's weapon in that competition, used instinctively or deliberately as a way of suppressing the psychic channel that feeds their competitor. Whether the hive mind understands this in any strategic sense, whether it has any awareness of the Chaos Gods as entities to be opposed, rather than simply environmental conditions to be navigated, is unknowable. The hive mind thinks in ways that no organism in the galaxy can fully parse, but the effect is the same regardless of the intent. Part 10. The Fourth War and the Shape of What Comes Next. The current state of the galaxy, from the perspective of the Tyranid threat, is the most dangerous it has ever been. This is not hyperbole. Every incremental shift in the lore, every narrative development, every codex update and campaign book has been pointing in the same direction for several years now, and the direction is toward a scale of conflict that dwarfs even the worst of what the previous tyrannic wars produced. Hive Fleet Leviathan did not stop after Baal. The imperial forces that celebrated the defeat of that particular tendril believed, perhaps understandably, that they had bought time, that the threat had been turned back, that Leviathan was broken. Leviathan was not broken. The version of Leviathan that now strikes the Segmentum Pacificus in the Fourth Tyrannic War is larger than the Leviathan that threatened Baal. It has grown. It has adapted. It has, in the years since Baal, consumed more worlds, processed more biomass, birthed new organisms from that material, and returned to the fight with everything it learned about the galaxy's defenses encoded into the flesh of the new bioforms it spawned. The Norn emissaries, an organism type deployed specifically during the Fourth Tyrannic War, are a direct response to one of the Imperium's primary defensive advantages, its exceptional commanders. The Norn emissary is a specialized assassination organism, a hive mind-spawned predator sent with a specific purpose. Find the best military minds the Imperium has, and kill them before they can organize effective resistance. The Bastior subsector, where Lord Solar Leontis established his command post for the Imperial response, became a target not because it had strategic value to the Tyranids in the traditional sense, but because it had the Imperium's best military mind in it. 3 Norn emissaries were deployed into the depths of the subsector, infiltrating past layers of Imperial security with a thoroughness that suggests the hive mind had been studying Leontis specifically, mapping his patterns, probing his defenses, preparing for the kill. Leontis survived, but only due to direct intervention by the Adeptus Custodes, the elite warriors who normally guard the Golden Throne and do not typically involve themselves in anything short of the most existential threats. The fact that the Custodes are in the field in numbers, that they have sallied forth from Terra in a way they have rarely done in 10,000 years of Imperial history, tells you something about how seriously the highest levels of Imperial authority are taking the current situation. These are warriors who exist to protect the Emperor. They are not deployed casually. The 3 tendrils of Leviathan attacking the Segmentum Pacificus represent a tactical evolution as well as a physical escalation. Grandillus, Nautilon, and Promothor do not simply attack from the direction of the galactic south, as previous Leviathan activity has tended to. They attack from above and below the galactic plane simultaneously, in a coordinated pincer that the Imperium's defensive orientation was not prepared for. The Soulblade strike forces, assembled by Robut-Guillemot as part of the Indomitus Crusade's ongoing work, have had some success in blunting the advance of Nautilon and Promothor, but Grendilus executed a maneuver that would be tactically elegant if it were not so devastating, sweeping behind the forces that moved to meet the first 2 tendrils and striking into the Bastior subsector from the rear. Imperial forces are now fighting on multiple fronts in the region, with supply lines under pressure from organisms that had infiltrated behind the front line before the battle was joined. Genestealer cults, activated across the Bastior subsector, rose in simultaneous revolt timed to Grendilus's arrival, compounding the chaos. The worlds that were supposed to serve as secure logistics nodes have insurrections in their underhives. The communication networks that were supposed to coordinate the defense have astropaths who cannot function properly under the growing weight of the shadow. The fortress worlds that were supposed to hold are discovering that the Tyranids have been adapting to fortresses for 3 tyrannic wars and have developed organisms that subvert those defenses in new ways. One note from the 10th edition Codex material worth dwelling on: the observation that the hive mind, in dealing with the Great Rift and the chaos energy bleeding through it into real space, has apparently developed something like a biological counter-strategy. Hive Fleet Kronos, specifically, appears to have been grown with a toolkit oriented toward dealing with warp-active threats, bioforms that suppress psychic activity and destroy entities that exist primarily in the psychic dimension. The hive mind encountered chaos as an obstacle and grew a fleet specifically designed to address it. If the Great Rift continues to deepen, and if chaos energy continues to contaminate the biomass the swarm depends on, the response of the hive mind will almost certainly be to grow more Kronos-type adaptations, progressively developing the biological infrastructure to fight the warp itself. The idea of an arms race between chaos and the Tyranids, fought through mutation and adaptation on one side, and infection and corruption on the other, is one that the lore is beginning to explore seriously. The outcome of such a race has implications for everyone else in the galaxy, all of whom are technically bystanders in a war between extinction and damnation. The current situation, as of the in-fiction present day, is one of active, desperate warfare. Hive Fleet Leviathan is not retreating. It is not being contained. It is being slowed, at enormous cost, in specific areas, while it continues to advance in others. More worlds fall silent. More stars become the centers of systems with nothing orbiting them but bare rock. The galaxy is shrinking, sector by sector, world by world, into the shadow of the swarm. And somewhere beyond the galactic rim, the rest of the Tyranids are still coming. Part 11. The True Answer Horror, Mystery, and Why the Not Knowing Matters. We have traveled a long way through this question. Let us now try to put together what the evidence actually suggests, what the lore confirms, what remains genuinely open, and why the openness is, in some ways, the most important thing about it. What do we know for certain? We know the Tyranids are extragalactic. They did not originate in the Milky Way. They crossed the intergalactic void to get here, a journey that began, for the fleets we have encountered, Roughly 10,000 years ago, when the overload of the Pharos device during the Battle of Sotha sent a psychic pulse across that void. Before the Pharos lit them up, they were drifting in the dark, almost certainly in transit between consumption events, possibly dormant in the way biological systems slow down when they lack energy inputs. We know they do not travel through the warp. They manipulate gravity with specialized organisms. This is slower than warp travel, but immune to the disruptions and horrors that make the warp dangerous. It is also suggestive of a species that either has no relationship with the warp at all, or has specifically evolved away from it. Given that the raw material of chaos is indigestible to Tyranids, the latter interpretation is interesting. Did the hive mind, at some point in its history, make a calculated decision to eliminate any biological dependence on the warp because the warp was too dangerous, too chaotic, too likely to interfere with a species that requires absolute predictability in its systems? Or did the Tyranids simply never develop a warp relationship because they come from a context where the warp is not present in the same way? We know that multiple hive fleets approach the Milky Way from multiple directions. This implies, strongly, that the Tyranids are not coming from a single direction. The local group may have been largely consumed. The fleets may have been independently active across multiple satellite galaxies and are converging on the Milky Way because it is the most biomass-rich target in their current range. We know that what has arrived so far is almost certainly not all of the Tyranids. Multiple sources within the lore, including a document in the 9th edition material that reportedly sent the High Lords of Terra into a crisis, suggest that the current Leviathan assault is a scouting force, that the main body of the Tyranid presence is still en route. If the fleets that have already consumed countless worlds and fought 4 tyrannic wars are the advance guard, the scale of what follows is beyond meaningful quantification with any currently available reference point. What do we suspect but cannot confirm? We suspect the hive mind is specifically drawn by the Astronomicon. The canonical lore says this outright in several places. Whether it was drawn to the galaxy initially by the Pharos, or whether the Astronomicon subsequently became the primary locus of attraction is somewhat ambiguous, but the consistent direction of the hive fleets toward the galactic core, toward Segmentum Solar, toward Terra, suggests something more than random feeding behavior. There is a target here. There is a goal. We suspect the fleets that have arrived may have been consuming their way through smaller galaxies before redirecting toward the Milky Way. The different approach vectors, the scale of the fleets, the suggestion that this is not the Tyranids' first galaxy, all of this points toward a species that has been doing this for a very long time and at a very large scale. The Milky Way is not their first meal. It may not even be their biggest. We do not know what came before. We do not know what drove them into the intergalactic void. We do not know whether hunger alone explains the crossing, or whether something else was involved. The possibility that something forced them out of their previous territory is not confirmed by any official source, but the circumstantial case is interesting, and the setting is careful never to fully close the door on it. Here is why that matters beyond simple narrative curiosity. The question of what the Tyranids are running from is not just a lore question. It is a question about the nature of the setting itself, about what kind of universe Warhammer 40K inhabits. If the Tyranids are here purely because they were hungry, and there is nothing else out there, then the setting is a story about a universe that is fundamentally indifferent to life, not hostile, not malicious, just indifferent. The Great Devourer is not cruel. It does not understand cruelty. It simply consumes because consuming is all it knows, and it does so with an efficiency and a scale that makes individual tragedy invisible against the aggregate horror. That is cosmic indifference. That is a very specific kind of horror, the Lovecraftian horror of a universe that does not notice you, that would consume you without rage or pleasure or even awareness of your existence. If there is something behind them, something that drove the hive mind across the intergalactic void, then the setting is a story about a universe that is genuinely, comprehensively, actively worse than the worst that can be imagined. Because the worst that can be imagined, in the context of Warhammer 40K, is already the Tyranids. They are the terminus of biological horror, the endpoint of every nightmare about invasion and consumption and extinction. And if even they are running, then the universe contains something for which there is no frame of reference, no preparation, no context that allows for comprehension. The genius of not answering this question is that both readings can coexist. The Tyranids can be running from nothing, because nothing drove them out, and the horror is that hunger this vast needs no other motivation. And the Tyranids can be running from something, and the horror is that whatever that something is has not yet arrived, and when it does, the combined forces of every faction in the galaxy, Imperial, Chaos, Aldari, Necron, Tau, everything, will be dealing with the Tyranids and whatever is behind them at the same time. The mystery is structural to the setting, in a way that answering it would break. The moment Games Workshop gives a name and a face to whatever drives the Tyranids, that thing becomes comprehensible. It joins the taxonomy of 40K threats. It gets a codex and a model range and stat lines and weaknesses that players can exploit. The terror shrinks to human scale. The incomprehensible becomes comprehensible, and something precious to the fiction is lost. But what makes the question worth asking, what makes it the kind of question that people keep coming back to decade after decade, is that the act of imagining the answer is itself the point. You take everything you know about the Tyranids, the scale of them, the completeness of their hunger, the fact that they have consumed what may be dozens of galaxies, and are still starving, still searching, still pressing forward with the relentless drive of something that cannot stop, and then you ask yourself, what could possibly be worse than this? And the answer is that you cannot imagine it. The answer is that your imagination fails. The answer is that there is a thing in the dark, outside the Milky Way, that makes the Great Devourer the lesser of two horrors, and you have no frame of reference for that thing, no way to contain it in a concept that makes it anything other than abstract dread. That is the answer to the question. Not a name, not a creature, not a faction or a force or a power. The answer is the failure of comprehension itself. The answer is the limit of what can be imagined, and the knowledge that the universe is not constrained by what you can imagine. In the 41st millennium, there is only war. But sometimes, war is the comfortable thing. War is something that can be fought, something with winners and losers, something that has been surviving in one form or another for 10,000 years. Whatever drove the Tyranids into the void may not be something that can be fought. It may be something that simply comes. And if it does come, if whatever is behind the Great Devourer ever crosses the intergalactic void and follows the Tyranids to the Milky Way, every living thing in this galaxy, every daemon and primarch and god emperor and Eldar Farseer and Necron Lord and Orc Warboss and Tau Commander, every last one of them will discover whether war is enough. The smart money says it probably is not. But we are not done yet. We have the matter of the Tyranids' relationship with the galaxy they are currently eating, and how close to the final shape of this story we actually are. The Great Rift, which split the galaxy in 999, M41, and opened an enormous channel between the warp and real space, has complicated every aspect of the Tyranid invasion in ways that are still being worked out in the fiction. On one hand, the psychic radiation bleeding from the rift poisons biomass that the Tyranids need. Worlds near the rift are less useful as food sources. Hive Fleet Kronos, grown specifically to counter chaos-influenced threats, is the hive mind's current answer to this problem, but it is an answer to a challenge that did not exist until relatively recently. The hive mind is adapting, as it always adapts, but the environment it is adapting to is one that is actively hostile to it in new ways. On the other hand, the Great Rift has weakened the Imperium in ways that have made the Tyranids' strategic position in many regions significantly stronger. Worlds that were defended and coordinated are now isolated in the Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the Astronomicon and from reinforcement. These worlds are far more vulnerable to Genestealer cult uprisings, to splinter fleet attacks, to the slow attrition of a presence the hive mind has been building for decades. The Great Rift is simultaneously a problem for the Tyranids and an opportunity, and the hive mind appears to be exploiting the opportunity while developing solutions to the problem in parallel. There is something almost admirable about the Tyranids if you can get sufficient distance from the horror to appreciate the engineering, a species that treats challenge as raw material, that responds to every obstacle by growing something new, that does not have that obstacle as a weakness, that does not have ego or pride or the capacity for discouragement, that cannot be demoralized or broken in spirit, because spirit is not a component of its architecture. That has been doing this, world by world, galaxy by galaxy, for a span of time that dwarfs the age of the Imperium, and may dwarf the age of civilization in this galaxy entirely. The Tyranids are not evil. That word requires a consciousness that chooses harm, and the hive mind does not choose in that sense. It does not select targets out of malice. It does not derive satisfaction from suffering. It is a biological process of enormous scale and extraordinary sophistication, and everything it does is in service of the same imperative that drives every living thing on every world in every galaxy. Eat, grow, persist. The difference is scope. The difference is scale. The difference is that when most organisms eat and grow and persist, they do so within an ecosystem, taking their share and leaving the rest for the rest. The hive mind has no concept of the rest. It takes everything, and it has been taking everything across the void between galaxies for longer than anyone can determine. What the Tyranids are actually running from. We can name two candidates, one certain and one uncertain. The certain candidate is starvation. They have consumed so much that they must keep moving, must keep finding new sources, because stopping means extinction, and the hive mind does not permit extinction. The uncertain candidate is something darker, something unconfirmed, something that sits in the dark outside the Milky Way and has not yet shown itself. Either answer is the correct answer, depending on what kind of horror you find most resonant. Either the universe is indifferent and vast, and the Tyranids are simply hunger made manifest, a biological force without greater meaning or context, or the universe is worse than you thought, and what we have taken for the most terrible thing in the setting is actually a messenger, a harbinger, a thing in flight from a darkness so absolute that the great devourer itself will not face it. Both of those answers are, in the deepest sense of the Warhammer 40K setting, completely appropriate. The universe of the 41st millennium is one in which the question of which horror is worse is not a rhetorical exercise. It is Tuesday. And Wednesday will probably be worse. The galaxy is being eaten. The Tyranids are still coming. The fourth tyrannic war is not the last tyrannic war. The full weight of the swarm is still somewhere beyond the galactic rim, crossing the dark in the long, patient hunger that has never been satisfied and will not be satisfied by consuming any finite thing. Whatever they are running from, if they are running from anything, it does not seem to be slowing them down. And somewhere in the deep void, in the silence between stars, the shadow in the warp is still spreading, still expanding, still smothering, still drowning the prayers and the screams, and the desperate signals of the things that have not yet been eaten. The question of what the Tyranids are running from is, in the end, the same as the question of what awaits the Milky Way at the other end of this. The great devourer is coming. Everything else is detail. Sleep well, and may whatever is behind you be slower than you are. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, drop a comment. Tell me your favorite piece of 40K lore, or your personal theory about what is behind the Tyranids, because I genuinely love reading through those. If you found this valuable, if you enjoyed the journey through this corner of one of the most extraordinary fictional universes ever constructed, please subscribe. It is the single best thing you can do to support this channel and to make sure you do not miss what comes next. There is a lot more of this coming. The 40K universe has more dark corners than any single video can illuminate, and we have barely started. Until next time, eyes up. The swarm is always closer than you think. Extended reflection. The Tyranids as a mirror of the universe. There is a philosophical dimension to the Tyranid threat that rarely receives sufficient exploration, and it is worth spending some time with it because it changes the way everything else about them reads. The Tyranids are often framed as a military problem, a threat to be combated, an enemy to be defeated. Imperial war planners and Adeptus Astartes chapter, Masters and Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos, tend to discuss them in terms of force projection and biological adaptation and the specific tactical challenges of fighting an enemy that fights differently every time you encounter it because it learned from the last encounter. These are legitimate and important frameworks, but they miss something. The Tyranids are also a statement about the nature of the universe. Think about what it means that the most dangerous force in the setting is not malicious. The chaos gods are malicious. They desire suffering and corruption in ways that are personal, in ways that feel like hatred and contempt expressed at a cosmic scale. Chaos wants you to suffer. It wants your soul to be twisted and broken and ultimately consumed by the warp, not because that is the optimal outcome for some mechanical process, but because the chaos gods genuinely want it, in whatever sense beings of their nature can want anything. There is something almost comprehensible about that. The hatred is scaled up enormously. The power behind it dwarfs anything in mortal experience. But the hatred itself is recognizable. Humans understand hatred. They have experienced it. They can model it. The Tyranids do not hate you. The hive mind does not feel anything about you specifically. You are biomass. You are a collection of organic molecules arranged in a particular pattern, and the particular pattern is irrelevant to the hive mind, except insofar as it needs to be dissolved to access the useful parts. Your civilization, your history, your art and your science, and your theology, and your love for other members of your species, none of it registers. The hive mind does not know those things exist, not because it lacks the intelligence to perceive them. It has extraordinary intelligence in the tactical and adaptive senses, but because its categories for processing the world do not include a concept of value that applies to things other than biological material, and the efficiency with which that material can be acquired and processed. This is the horror that the Tyranids represent at the deepest level, not cruelty, indifference. The universe, it turns out, can contain things that are utterly destructive of everything you are, without those things bearing any particular feeling about the destruction. The fire that burns a house down does not hate the house, it simply burns. The Tyranids simply consume, and the scale of the consumption is the scale of the universe's indifference, made manifest in biological form. Now pair this with the question of what they are running from, and something interesting happens to the framing. If the Tyranids are here purely because of hunger, because they consumed everything else they could reach and needed a new feeding ground, then the universe's indifference is the deepest truth of the setting. Everything in the Milky Way, every civilization, every individual life, every moment of meaning or beauty or horror or love that has occurred across 100,000 years of recorded history is incidental to a biological process at cosmological scale that does not notice it. The grim darkness of the far future is darkness in the specific sense of a universe where the lights that would make meaning visible are simply too small to matter to the things large enough to move at the scale of galaxies. But if something is behind the Tyranids, if there is a force or entity that even the Great Devourer recognizes as a threat and runs from, then the universe is not merely indifferent. It is actively, incomprehensibly worse than indifference. Indifference, at least, does not pursue you. What pursues the Great Devourer has to be something that the most consuming biological force in the universe cannot simply eat its way through. Something that either cannot be consumed because it is not biological in any way the Tyranids' tools can process, or something that can be consumed but consumes back faster, or something that operates on principles so different from biology, and even from the psychic, that the hive mind, despite all its adaptability, has no response to it. The terror of the second scenario is not just that something worse exists. The terror is that the Tyranids, by running toward the Milky Way, have potentially led it here. The Great Devourer, fleeing something it cannot face, has crossed the intergalactic void and arrived in the galaxy with the densest concentration of psychic life in the local group. A galaxy full of creatures whose lives generate exactly the kind of psychic energy that some entities feed on. A galaxy with a dying god at its center, broadcasting its presence across 50,000 light-years. The Tyranids, whatever drove them here, are now here. And whatever drove them here knows which direction they went. The Milky Way is not the destination. The Milky Way might be the hideout. And whatever is hunting them does not hide. Extended reflection. The Swarm Lord and the memory of everything. The Swarm Lord deserves an extended meditation because it is, in certain respects, the Tyranids' answer to the question of what an individual within the swarm actually is. And that answer illuminates something important about the nature of the hive mind and the question of what it might be fleeing. Every other Tyranid organism is replaceable. Every hormigont that dies, every carnifex that falls, Every hive tyrant that is brought down by a Space Marine Terminator squad or a precise artillery strike, the loss is metabolic, not meaningful. The hive mind loses whatever that organism was contributing to the network, and it spawns another to replace it from the next available batch of biomass. The dead organism is recycled if possible. Its genetic material is retained in the Norn Queen's gene banks. Its death teaches the hive mind something about what kills Tyranids in the current engagement, which is useful information. Nothing is truly wasted. The Swarmlord is different, and the difference is philosophically significant in a way that the lore does not always foreground clearly enough. The Swarmlord is summoned by the hive mind only when conventional approaches have failed, only when the opposition encountered is sophisticated enough that the standard toolkit of the swarm is insufficient. It is the hive mind's admission that a problem exists which its usual methods cannot solve, and its response to that admission. In this sense, the Swarmlord is the most honest expression of what the hive mind actually is, not a simple consuming machine, but a learning system that recognizes the limits of its current capabilities and creates new capabilities in response to them. What the Swarmlord carries that no other organism carries is continuity of self across death. When a hive tyrant dies, the organism is gone. The hive mind retains the genetic template, can create another hive tyrant of similar capability, but the specific configuration of that tyrant's experience, the exact texture of what it had learned and done and been, that is lost. The Swarmlord, when it dies, is absorbed differently. Its entire experiential content, every tactical engagement, every opponent it has faced, every death it has died, every lesson each death has taught it, all of it is specifically retained and downloaded into the next instantiation. The Swarmlord that faces Marneus Calgar on some future battlefield will have the memory of every previous encounter the Swarmlord has ever had with Space Marine commanders, going back to the very first time the hive mind created it, wherever that was, in whatever galaxy that occurred. This means the Swarmlord is, in a very real sense, as old as the Tyranid race itself. The lore confirms this explicitly. The Swarmlord has been dying and being reborn since the beginning of the species. Its bone sabers, the weapons it wields, contain crystalline growths that are not native to the Milky Way, materials from wherever the Tyranids came from originally. The Swarmlord is, in a literal sense, carrying physical matter from outside the Milky Way. It is a living record of the Tyranid species' entire history, encoded in experience and memory, and the specific adaptations of a consciousness that has been learning continuously for millions of years. When the Swarmlord appears on a battlefield, you are not fighting a particularly capable example of a hive tyrant. You are fighting the accumulated tactical wisdom of an organism that has been dying and learning and returning for longer than the Imperium has existed, potentially longer than humanity has been spacefaring, possibly longer than humanity has been fully modern. You are fighting something that has likely faced opponents more dangerous than you, in galaxies whose names are not recorded anywhere in the known universe, and has found ways to kill every one of them. The crystalline growths in its bone sabers are worth focusing on for a moment, because they are one of the most haunting details in the Tyranid lore. These are materials from outside the Milky Way. They are, in the most literal sense possible, evidence that the Swarmlord has been somewhere before here. Not just theoretically evidence, as the Tyranids being extragalactic is evidence of their prior existence elsewhere, but physical material artifacts of that elsewhere, carried into the current galaxy in the weapons of the most significant warrior the hive mind can produce. What did those crystals come from? What environment outside the Milky Way produced materials with properties significant enough for the hive mind to specifically maintain them through millennia of rebirths? What did the Swarmlord, in its previous incarnations across previous galaxies, encounter that required a weapon with those specific properties? These questions do not have answers in the current lore. But the questions themselves are the content. The physical evidence of the Swarmlord's pre-Milky Way history, embodied in those alien crystals, is a reminder that there is a whole history of the Tyranids that takes place in a context we have never seen and cannot imagine. Extended reflection, the Tyranids and the Necrons, an ancient relationship. There is a thread in the lore that connects the Tyranids to the Necrons in ways that are rarely discussed, but are genuinely illuminating when considered carefully. This connection does not involve any cooperation or alliance between the two factions, obviously. The Necrons are metal and energy, fundamentally indigestible to biological consumers, and the Tyranids have no concept of alliance, only of consumption. But the connection is real, and it involves the war in heaven, the cosmological conflict between the Necrons and the Old Ones that predates the current age of the galaxy by millions of years. The war in heaven was fought between the Necrontyr, who had given up their biological bodies for immortality and metal, and the Old Ones, the ancient species that had been the galaxy's dominant civilization for untold ages. The Old Ones had access to the warp in ways the Necrontyr did not, and they used that access to create champions and servants capable of fighting the Metal Legions. The Aeldari were among these creations. The Orcs were among them. Various other species were seeded with psychic potential and martial capability to serve as tools in the Old Ones' war against the Necrons and their masters, the C'tan. The war in heaven ended catastrophically. The Necrons won, in the sense that the Old Ones were destroyed or driven to extinction, but the victory was Pyrrhic in the extreme. The psychic entities spawned in the warp during millennia of conflict between sapient species on an enormous scale had created 4 new entities of vast power, the precursors of the Chaos Gods. The Necrons found their C'tan masters, those star-devouring beings of pure energy who had consumed the life force of suns and turned the Necrontyr into metal warriors, were as dangerous as any enemy. The Necrons rebelled against the C'tan, shattering them into shards and imprisoning those shards in containment devices. Then the Necrons entered their great sleep, the long hibernation that was supposed to last until the galaxy was safe, or at least until the Old Ones' creations had torn each other apart enough to be manageable. The Tyranids are not explicitly part of the War in Heaven narrative. They come from outside the galaxy, and their arrival postdates the War in Heaven by an enormous margin. But there is a connection between the Tyranids and the Necrons that runs through the deepest levels of the setting's cosmology. The Old Ones were the masters of biological engineering. They created species and shaped evolution across the galaxy on a scale that makes the Tyranids' engineering look almost modest by comparison. Though, of course, the Tyranids are doing their engineering on a galactic scale for consumption purposes rather than construction purposes. The Old Ones seeded the warp with psychic life. They are, in certain readings of the lore, responsible for the conditions that made the Chaos Gods possible. What if the Tyranids are older than the War in Heaven? What if the organism that would become the Great Devourer was already ancient when the Old Ones were still young? What if the Tyranids crossed intergalactic voids in their past, not just in their recent history, but as part of a pattern that has been repeating since before the Milky Way's current civilizations existed? The Old Ones, in their galactic dominion, might have known about the Tyranids, might have encountered them, might have understood what they represented in a way that no current civilization does, because the Old Ones had the knowledge and the cosmic perspective to see things that a civilization limited to a single galaxy simply cannot perceive. If the Old Ones knew about the Tyranids and chose not to stop them, or tried to stop them and failed, that is one kind of terrible story. If the Old Ones created or modified the Tyranids for some purpose related to the War in Heaven that subsequently escaped their control and became something independently catastrophic, that is another kind of terrible story. If the Tyranids are the remnant or transformation of something the Old Ones built to fight the C'tan, and that transformation went wrong in ways the Old Ones could not have anticipated, that is yet another kind of terrible story. None of these are canonical. All of them are possible within the gaps of what the lore has established, and the gaps are significant precisely because they are maintained carefully rather than accidentally. The connection between the Tyranids, the Old Ones, the War in Heaven, and the deeper history of the galaxy is a thread that the setting pulls at but never follows to its end. And the reason for that careful restraint is the same reason the question of what drives the Tyranids is kept open. The answer would make things too definite, too comprehensible, too manageable in imagination. The horror lives in the uncertainty. What is certain is that the Necrons and the Tyranids have a relationship that goes beyond simple opposition. When the Necrons awoke from their long sleep and found the galaxy infested with Tyranid organisms, certain of the more strategically minded Necron lords recognized the threat immediately in terms that the Necron experience uniquely equipped them to assess. The Necron Silent King, Sarek, who in the ancient past had ordered the surrender of his own free will to the C'tan to gain the power to fight the Old Ones, returned to the galaxy in the current era specifically because he recognized the Tyranid threat as something that required a coordinated galactic response, not an Imperial response, not a Necron response. A galactic response, involving every faction with a stake in the survival of the Milky Way as a biologically and psychically active place. The Silent King formed temporary alliances with the Imperium against Tyranid incursions in the early era Indomitus. He coordinated with Blood Angel's forces against Leviathan in ways that would have been unthinkable before his return. He spoke of the Tyranids not merely as a military threat, but as an existential one in terms that suggested personal knowledge of what happens to a galaxy when such things are allowed to complete their work. Whether the Necron's ancient history includes direct encounters with the Tyranids, either here or in some other context the lore has not yet explored, remains one of the more intriguing open questions of the current setting. Extended reflection. The role of Hive Fleet Tiamat and the deepest mystery. Of all the Hive fleets that have been observed in the Milky Way, one stands apart as genuinely inexplicable by normal Tyranid logic, and that is Hive Fleet Tiamat. Tiamat has been associated with some of the earliest genestealer presences in the galaxy, with organisms detected in the Tiamat system as far back as M35, long before any of the major Hive fleet invasions. But what makes Tiamat unique, what makes it worth dwelling on at length, is what it did not do. Every other Tyranid force that has successfully consumed a world or a system has left behind only the biological rear guard, small organisms placed to discourage recolonization and to send a signal if sufficient biomass returns. The stripped world is abandoned as a dead cinder. The fleet moves on. That is the pattern. It has never varied across every documented Tyranid engagement in recorded Imperial history. Tiamat consumed the Tiamat system and then stayed. The Tyranids did not move on. They fortified. They converted the system's remaining matter into the raw material for continued operations. They seeded the outer reaches with defensive organisms. They behaved as if the Tiamat system were not a feeding stop, but a destination, a location that the hive mind had decided to maintain rather than consume and abandon. The Ordo Xenos discovered this with appropriately significant horror. Imperial forces that attempted to enter the Tiamat system found not a consumed dead system, but a system actively defended by Tyranid organisms at a level of intensity that suggested the hive mind considered this location important. Not just as a strategic staging point, not just as a reserve of biomass for future consumption, but important in a way that the hive mind is not supposed to categorize anything. Locations are food. The hive mind does not keep locations. It does not maintain bases or homeworlds or places of significance. That is not how it works. Except here. Why is the Tiamat system special? What is there that the hive mind values beyond biological material? There is no confirmed answer. The Ordo Xenos has dedicated significant resources to investigating the Tiamat system from safe distances, and what they have observed suggests that something within the system is being actively protected, built around, maintained. There are structures in the system that have no clear tactical function, enormous constructions that seem to be architectural rather than military or biological in purpose. The hive mind, which builds everything it creates for a specific functional reason, has built something in Tiamat that no one can identify the function of. Some theories proposed by Ordo Xenos analysts, and it is worth emphasizing that these are theories held by people who study the Tyranids professionally and spend their careers developing frameworks for understanding them, propose that the Tiamat system contains something related to the Tyranids' origin, a record perhaps of where they came from, a seed, something that represents the continuation of whatever the hive mind is before any specific fleet or generation of organisms. Something that would survive the consumption of the current galaxy and carry the Tyranids' essential nature forward into the next. Others propose that the Tiamat system contains something to do with the shadow in the warp and the hive mind's relationship with the psychic dimension. The Tyranids have a psychic presence, despite not engaging with the warp in the way other species do, and that presence manifests in the shadow as something that even demonic entities find threatening. There may be something in Tiamat that relates to that relationship, some mechanism or device or natural phenomenon that the hive mind is using as an anchor point for something larger than a single fleet's campaign. The strangest theory, and the one that connects most directly to the question of what might be behind the Tyranids, is that the Tiamat system contains something related to whatever the Tyranids are running from. Not a defense against it, necessarily, but a sensor, an early warning system. Something that was designed to detect the approach of whatever the hive mind fears, giving it sufficient warning to redirect its consumed mass and reproductive capacity in response. In this reading, the Tiamat system is not a base, but a watchtower, and the hive mind has positioned it specifically because of its line of sight to something the rest of the galaxy cannot perceive. This theory has no confirmation. It cannot be confirmed because investigating the Tiamat system in sufficient depth to answer these questions would require entering the most heavily defended Tyranid position in the Milky Way, with forces sufficient to overcome that defense, and such an operation has never been successfully executed. But the theory is noted in Ordo Xenos records as credible enough to be maintained as a possibility rather than dismissed, which is the closest thing to official endorsement that this kind of speculation tends to receive in imperial scholarly circles. Whatever Tiamat is, it is the most compelling single piece of evidence that the hive mind has purposes that go beyond simple consumption, that its agenda includes something that current understanding of the Tyranids cannot fully account for. And it is the most tantalizing hint in the entire Tyranid lore that the question of what they are running from may eventually have an answer, and that answer may be visible, in some form, from within the Milky Way. Extended reflection. What victory against the Tyranids would actually look like? To understand the full weight of the Tyranid threat, it is worth asking a question that Imperial strategic planning mostly avoids. What would winning actually look like? Not winning a battle, not breaking a specific hive fleet, not surviving another tyrannic war by devastating cost and narrow margin, actually winning, ending the Tyranid threat permanently. The answer, when you follow the logic of the setting honestly, is almost impossibly large. Winning against the Tyranids in any temporary sense, the kind of winning the Imperium has achieved in each tyrannic war, means breaking specific fleets. Breaking a fleet does not destroy the organisms that composed it. Many scatter as splinter fleets that persist for centuries, continuing to consume whatever they can reach, growing back toward larger coherence over time. Destroying the Norn queens of a specific fleet and ensuring that no organisms survive to reconstitute is more effective, but has never been fully achieved even in the most decisive Imperial victories. And even if it were achieved, even if a specific hive fleet were somehow entirely annihilated, the hive mind retains the knowledge that fleet had accumulated and distributes it to the next fleet that approaches. To win permanently against the Tyranids in the Milky Way, you would need to destroy every Tyranid organism in the galaxy, including every dormant spore, every lurking genstealer in an underhive that has not yet been discovered, every rearguard organism on a previously consumed world, every organism in transit between systems. The rearguard organisms are specifically designed to be hard to detect and eliminate, surviving in conditions where nothing else can live, waiting for the biomass to return so they can signal for the fleet. A world the Tyranids have consumed is not sterile in the biological sense of the word. It is still occupied by things that look like nothing but can grow into something given sufficient time and material. The deeper problem is that winning in the Milky Way would not end the Tyranid threat if the main body of the swarm is still en route. The fleets that have arrived represent, by multiple lore accounts, a fraction of the total Tyranid presence. If those fleets were somehow entirely destroyed and their knowledge entirely lost to the collective, the main body would arrive in the Milky Way with less information about its defenses than it currently has, which would be advantageous, but it would still arrive. The fleets sent as scouts were sent precisely because the main body was coming. The scouts' destruction cannot divert the main body, because the main body is following the Astronomicon and the psychic signal of the Emperor, not the reports of the advance guard. To genuinely end the Tyranid threat, you would need to destroy the main body of the swarm before it arrives. This requires the ability to project force across the intergalactic void at the scale of an entire species that has been growing and consuming and adapting for millions of years. No faction in the current galaxy has anything close to that capability. The Necrons in their prime might have had weapons at that scale. Some of the Citan star-killing devices are described in terms that suggest genuinely cosmological power. Whether those weapons still exist, whether they could be deployed against an extragalactic threat, is not established. Alternatively, winning might involve making the Milky Way not worth consuming. If the galaxy could somehow be made hostile to biological life in a way the Tyranids could not overcome, stripped of the biomass that makes it a viable target, the hive mind might redirect. But making a galaxy hostile to biological life in that way is effectively the same as destroying all life in the galaxy, which is a fairly specific kind of victory that is difficult to distinguish from the defeat you were trying to avoid. The most honest answer the setting provides to the question of what victory would look like is that it does not look like anything currently available, and that the appropriate response to this is not despair, but endurance. The Imperium has survived 4 tyrannic wars. Each survival has cost enormous amounts. Each survival has also taught the galaxy more about how to fight the swarm. The Necrons are awakening to a galaxy that needs their ancient knowledge and capability. Primarchs are returning. New technologies and strategies are being developed under the pressure of existential threat. The galaxy is not static, and the Tyranids, for all their adaptability, are not unstoppable by the logic of the setting's own internal rules. They can bleed. They can die. Inquisitor Kryptman said this before his excommunication, in what became one of the most quoted lines about the Tyranid threat. They can bleed and they can die. This is true. It does not solve the problem of scale, or the problem of the main body still en route, or the problem of what might be behind them, but it is a place to start. It is a principle that, if applied at sufficient scale, with sufficient resource and sufficient cooperation between factions that normally spend their time trying to kill each other, might constitute the beginning of something that could, eventually, improbably, to be called a strategy. The 41st millennium does not do hope very well, but it does do endurance. It does do the kind of stubborn, grinding, costly survival that is the only thing available when hope is too expensive. And that endurance, that refusal to simply stop, is perhaps the truest answer the setting provides to the question of what victory looks like. Not triumph, not safety, just continuation. One more day, one more battle, one more world defended, at whatever cost. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The Tyranids are part of that war, and the war goes on. A final word on the mystery. We have traveled a long way through this question, and the honest conclusion is that the setting has given us all the pieces and none of the answer. The Tyranids came from outside the galaxy. They were in the intergalactic void when the Pharaoh's signal reached them. They have consumed what may be dozens of galaxies across a span of time that dwarfs recorded human history. They approach the Milky Way from multiple directions, suggesting multiple points of origin in the local intergalactic space. They are pressing harder and faster in the current era than in any previous period of their presence in this galaxy. They maintain at least one system in a way that defies normal Tyranid behavioral patterns and suggests purposes that go beyond simple consumption. What does it mean? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that the not knowing is by design. Games Workshop has maintained this ambiguity across decades of accumulated lore, across dozens of codices and campaign books and novels and shorter fiction, and the maintenance of ambiguity has been consistent and deliberate enough to be a statement in itself. The statement is, this is the edge of the comprehensible. Beyond this edge is the genuinely unknown, the place where even the most careful and detailed world building gives way to something that resists definition. The Tyranids are the great devourer. They are the largest, most comprehensive biological threat the galaxy has ever faced. They are what hunger looks like when it is scaled to the size of a universe. And somewhere in the dark beyond the galactic rim, something made them come here. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe pure hunger was sufficient. The galaxy's biomass, a beacon they followed across the void, because they were starving and the Pharaohs lit the way. In that reading, the universe is vast and cold and contains things that consume everything in their path without malice or meaning. And the only appropriate response is to fight back until you cannot fight anymore. Maybe it was something, maybe there is an entity or force in the dark beyond the Milky Way that even the great devourer recognizes as a threat. Maybe the hive fleets that have consumed countless worlds and driven the galaxy to the edge of extinction are themselves fleeing something worse. In that reading, The universe is not just vast and cold, but specifically arranged to contain horrors in layers, each layer worse than the one before. And the grim darkness of the far future is the least dark part of a universe that gets progressively more terrible the further from the familiar center you travel. Both answers are correct answers for the setting. The question is, which kind of horror resonates more deeply with you? The horror of indifference, or the horror of pursuit? The horror of a universe that does not notice you, or the horror of a universe that is being noticed by something you have not yet seen? Either way, the Tyranids are coming. The shadow in the warp is spreading. Worlds are falling silent, and the question of what is behind them is still waiting in the dark for someone brave enough or foolish enough to go look. Extended reflection. The shadow in the warp and what the Chaos Gods understand about the Tyranids. There is a moment in the Third Tyrannic War that deserves far more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the conflict, and that is the Battle of Baal. Not the battle itself, which is extensively documented in the Blood Angels chapter history and has its own library of campaign and narrative material, but a specific element of what happened at Baal that illuminates something critical about the Tyranids' relationship with every other major force in the setting. At Baal, in the final desperate stages of the Blood Angels' defense of their home system against the largest Tyranid tendril that had ever been encountered to that point, something happened that should not have happened by any normal reading of the setting's internal logic. The demonic forces of Khorne, led by the ancient bloodthirster Kabanda, joined the battle. Not on the side of the Blood Angels, not on the side of the Tyranids, on the side of Kabanda's ancient grudge against the sons of Sanguinius, which Kabanda had maintained across 10,000 years of enmity, and which he was not about to share with a species that eats everything and leaves nothing behind. Kabanda did not come to Baal to save the Blood Angels. He came to Baal because Kabanda had decided that he alone would be responsible for the Blood Angels' final destruction, and therefore any Tyranid organisms trying to destroy the Blood Angels were in the way of Kabanda's personal project. The Bloodthirster fought the Tyranids the way a landowner fights a competing predator on their territory, not out of any feeling for the prey species, out of a proprietorial sense that the destruction of the Blood Angels was his, not the swarm's, and he would defend that right with the full fury of a greater daemon of the Blood God. The Chaos Forces attacked the Tyranids. The Tyranid swarm attacked everything. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters fought both. Baal became a three-way catastrophe of extraordinary violence that, combined with the warp storms generated by the formation of the Great Rift and the resulting chaos that disrupted portions of the Leviathan fleet in orbit, resulted in the breaking of that particular tendril of Leviathan. What this episode reveals about the Tyranids is something that standard military analysis of the threat tends to underweight. The Tyranids are, in a very specific sense, the common enemy of both the Imperium and chaos. Not because the Chaos Gods are benevolent or care about the survival of the galaxy's living creatures in any normal sense. The opposite, in fact. The Chaos Gods want the living creatures of the galaxy to suffer and be corrupted, and ultimately to feed the warp with their tormented souls. But the Tyranids want to consume those creatures entirely, leaving nothing for the warp to harvest. A galaxy that has been stripped to bare rock by the Tyranids is a galaxy that generates no psychic energy, sustains no emotional resonance, produces no souls for the warp to feed on. The Chaos Gods, in the deepest reading of the setting's theology, cannot actually want the Tyranids to win, not because they care about life, but because they are dependent on life, on the psychic residue of living creatures experiencing emotion and belief and suffering. Chaos is parasitic on the living in a way that the Tyranids' more literal form of consumption would ultimately end. A Chaos God in a galaxy stripped by the Tyranids would be a Chaos God slowly starving, its power diminishing as the source of its sustenance vanished world by world. This is why the Great Rift's formation, while tremendously powerful and devastating to the Imperium, can also be read as an act of desperation rather than triumph. The Chaos Gods opened an enormous wound in reality, flooding the galaxy with demonic presence and warp energy, not just because they could or because it served their immediate goals, but because the Tyranid threat represented an existential challenge to the very fabric of what the warp feeds on. Get the souls now, before the swarm eats the bodies. Corrupt what can be corrupted before the Tyranids consume it. The shadow in the warp, that psychic phenomenon that precedes the Tyranid advance and drowns out all other signals in the immaterium, is in this context as much a threat to chaos as to the Imperium. It does not merely disrupt mortal communication, it suppresses the psychic resonance that the warp's entities depend on. It creates dead zones in the immaterium, where the Chaos God's power is diminished, where daemons cannot maintain coherent form as easily, where the warp itself is less the seething ocean of emotion and more a muted, flattened reflection of something vast and hungry pressing in from outside. The daemons fear it, not in the way mortal creatures fear things, not with the specific chemistry of biological terror, but in whatever functional equivalent of fear applies to entities that are themselves creatures of the psychic dimension. They recoil from the shadow. They do not press forward into it when the hive mind is advancing. This is not cowardice in any traditional sense. It is the behavior of something that recognizes a threat, that its nature makes it particularly vulnerable to, the way a fire recedes from the approach of water. And if the Chaos Gods, the most powerful entities in the local psychic dimension, are functionally opposed to the Tyranids in this deep structural sense, then the question of what drove the Tyranids here becomes even more interesting. Because the strongest candidate for whatever might have sent the Tyranids running is chaos, or some larger version of chaos that operates on an intergalactic scale beyond anything the Milky Way's Chaos Gods represent. If chaos outside the Milky Way is capable of consuming an entire galaxy's worth of biomass faster than the Tyranids can consume it, making the territory functionally hostile to the swarm, that would be a reason to leave, not a defeat in the tactical sense. A recognition of an environment that offers no sustainable return. The hive mind is, above all else, efficient. It does not fight battles. It cannot win profitably. A galaxy where chaos energy has so thoroughly contaminated the biological matter that the Tyranids cannot process it would not be worth fighting for. Is this what happened? Did the Tyranids leave their previous territory because chaos had made it indigestible? Or did they simply eat everything and move on? The answer, once again, is that we do not know. But the relationship between the Tyranids and chaos is the most revealing lens through which to examine the question, because it is the relationship that the setting has the most to say about, even when it is saying it indirectly. And what it says is that these two forces are in fundamental conflict in ways that go far beyond simple military opposition. Extended reflection. The lictors and the patience of the predator. The lictor deserves its own examination, not because it is the most powerful Tyranid organism or the most strategically significant, but because it reveals something about the hive mind's approach to time and planning that illuminates the question of why the Tyranids operate the way they do. A lictor is a solitary organism. It is chameleonic, capable of biological camouflage that makes it effectively invisible against the backgrounds of any environment it needs to move through. It is fast, faster than a space marine in open ground. It is extraordinarily lethal in close combat, its rending claws capable of tearing through ceramite armor that deflects bolter fire. And it operates entirely alone, without the support of the broader swarm, without the direction of synapse creatures, which means it maintains its own purpose and focus using whatever low-level intelligence the hive mind has given it for autonomous function. The lictor precedes the swarm. It arrives on target worlds days, weeks, or months before the main assault. It moves through the wilderness and the cities and the fortifications, collecting sensory data about the prey species, learning the layout of defenses, identifying the locations of key leadership targets, assessing the specific biological characteristics of the dominant species present. This information is transmitted back to the hive mind, feeding into the adaptive calculation that produces the specific mix of bioforms the Norn queens will spawn for the assault. A single lictor on a world is a statement about how far in advance the hive mind is thinking. If a lictor is present on your world, the fleet is not here yet. The fleet is days or weeks away at minimum. But the fleet is already thinking about your world in enough detail to have sent a specialist organism to gather specific intelligence. Your defenses are being studied. Your people are being cataloged. The genetic material that will determine what organisms the hive mind deploys against you is being collected by a thing you cannot see moving through your cities right now. The lictors, like the genestealer cults, are evidence of a patient intelligence. A swarm that simply charged at everything would not send scouts. A hunger so immediate and overwhelming that it could not wait would not dispatch advance units to gather information before the main force arrived. The hive mind is patient in ways that its most famous large-scale behavior, the overwhelming mass assault, does not suggest. The patience is structural. It is the patience of a predator that has been perfecting its hunting strategy across millions of years of existence and has learned that the investment in preparation consistently produces more efficient consumption. This patience is one of the most disturbing features of the Tyranid threat when you take the long view. The Tyranids have been in the Milky Way, in some form, since roughly M35. The Ymgarl genestealers, the moons of Ymgarl being one of the earliest documented encounters with Tyranid organisms, may date back to that era. M35 is approximately 6,000 years before the current 41st millennium. The Tyranids have been in this galaxy, seeding it, studying it, preparing it for 6,000 years. The major hive fleet invasions began only 250 years ago, with Behemoth. Before Behemoth, for nearly 6,000 years, the galaxy was being quietly prepared. All the genestealer cults that are now active across the Imperium, in the underhives and the labor gangs and the mining settlements and the military regiments, all of them trace their infection lineages back to organisms that arrived and began the work centuries or millennia ago. The vast majority of those lineages were never detected. They simply grew, generation by generation, waiting with a patience that no individual member of the cult experienced, but that the collective structure embodied. The long game stretched across 6,000 years of quiet infiltration. The hive mind has been patient for 6,000 years in this galaxy alone. How patient has it been in the galaxies before this one? How many cycles of patient infiltration and explosive consumption has it completed across the span of its existence? The Swarmlord's bone sabers carry crystalline material from outside the Milky Way. The hive mind has existed elsewhere. The patience we are observing here, this 6,000-year preparation process, is not new behavior. It is the behavior of something that has been doing this for as long as it has existed, that has refined this approach across uncountable previous campaigns, that knows exactly how long to wait, because it has done this so many times that the waiting is automatic, encoded in the species' biological architecture like any other instinct. Whatever the Tyranids are running from, they have been running patiently. The crossing of the intergalactic void, the arrival of advanced organisms, the generations of genestealer infiltration, the initial probing attacks of the early hive fleets, all of it has been conducted with the same systematic patience that defines the species. Even if something is behind them, they are not running in a blind panic. They are running with the methodical efficiency of an organism that has learned to move at the speed that best serves its survival. And that speed is the speed of deep time, not human time, not even the 10,000-year time frame of the Imperium, but the time frame of species and glaciers, and the slow turn of galaxies around their central masses. Extended reflection, what the silence tells you. The most eloquent evidence for the Tyranid threat is often nothing at all. Worlds go silent. This is the marker the Imperium has learned to watch for. A world that stops sending astropathic communications, a world that stops responding to Vox signals, a world whose regular scheduled reports simply do not arrive. This is the warning that something has happened. In most cases, the explanation is mundane. A warp storm, disrupting communications. A local rebellion suppressing transmissions. Equipment failure on a remote station. The galaxy is enormous, and the Imperium's communication infrastructure, impressive as it is for maintaining coherence across 1 million worlds, is imperfect and subject to the countless small failures that afflict any system of that scale. But there is a specific pattern of silence that Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos have learned to recognize, that the Death Watch has coded into its automated monitoring systems across the Eastern Fringe and other Tyranid-prone regions. A world that goes silent is one thing. A system that goes silent is more concerning. A pattern of worlds going silent in a sequence, each silence appearing to move in a direction. Each subsequent silence, located slightly further along a path from the previous ones. This is different. This is not equipment failure. This is the shadow in the warp, spreading ahead of an advancing fleet. The worlds that went silent before Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived at Tyran were noticed by the adepts of Tyran, specifically because of the pattern. Worlds were stripped in a sequence that made directional sense, a direction that pointed toward the next likely target. Magos Varnak understood what he was looking at. He had the intellectual tools to recognize a predator advancing, and the courage, or perhaps the duty-bound professionalism, to create a record of what he observed before his world joined the silence. Every major tyrannic war has had its version of this recognition moment, where someone who knew enough to look at the pattern of silences rather than each silence individually understood that something was coming, and that it was worse than anything previously on record. Cryptman with Behemoth. Cryptman again, burned out and stripped of his rank, but right with Leviathan. The pattern recognition is the same each time. The silences spread, the shadow advances, and the silence is absolute. Not the intermittent silence of equipment, failure, or local disruption, but the permanent silence of absence, of everything that was there simply not being there anymore. A world that has been consumed by the Tyranids does not produce radiation signatures consistent with exterminatus. It does not show the specific damage patterns of orbital bombardment or conventional warfare. It shows the signatures of biological activity followed by the complete cessation of biological activity. Its atmosphere altered over days or weeks as everything that was generating and processing gases in the biosphere stops, its electromagnetic output changing as the technology that had been in use by its civilization ceases to function and is not replaced. It looks, when examined closely, like a world that simply died. And it did, in the most literal sense, not destroyed, not conquered, just done. The life that was there is gone. The matter that composed that life is somewhere in the Hive fleet now, converted into new organisms that will eventually be sent against the next target. The world has been recycled. The recycling was thorough. This is what the Tyranid threat looks like from a distance. A spreading pattern of deaths so complete that even the usual markers of violence are absent. No ruins that look like bombing. No mass graves that look like execution. No burned fields that look like scorched earth warfare. Just absence. The specific quality of a world from which all life has been removed so completely that the removal itself is invisible, replaced only by the sterility of rock and the silence of an atmosphere, with nothing left to generate the sounds that life makes. In the end, the question of what the Tyranids are running from is inseparable from the question of what they leave behind. And what they leave behind, world after world, system after system, galaxy after galaxy, if the lore's darkest implications are true, is that silence, the complete absence of the noise that life makes. The absolute quiet of a universe that used to contain something and now contains only the memory of something, and not even the memory, because memory requires someone to hold it. The Tyranids consume even the memories. Everything they touch becomes either part of the swarm or nothing. And the nothing they leave is vast enough to have preceded them across the intergalactic void, vast enough to be the context in which we find them now, vast enough to suggest that whatever drove them here is capable of adding to it rather than filling it. Whatever is in the dark behind the Great Devourer understands silence the way the Tyranids do, as something that follows you wherever you go. As something you make of everywhere you have been. The silence is coming. It is always already coming. The question is only what precedes it. Extended reflection. The hive mind's relationship with psychic life, and why the Emperor is a beacon. One of the most consistently stated pieces of lore about the Tyranids is that the Astronomicon is drawing them toward Terra, toward the galactic core, toward the densest population center of psychic life in the Milky Way. But this relationship between the hive mind and psychic energy is worth exploring in depth because it is genuinely strange and has implications that go well beyond simply explaining why the Tyranids are heading in a particular direction. The Tyranids do not use the warp. This is a firm canonical point. They navigate through real space using specialized organisms called narvhals that manipulate gravitational fields to achieve superluminal transit. They have no navigators, no psychers in the conventional sense, no dependence on or connection to the immaterium. The raw matter of chaos is indigestible to them. They avoid warp-saturated regions when possible because those regions cannot sustain them, and because the energies involved interfere with the biological processes they depend on. And yet the Tyranids have a psychic presence. The shadow in the warp is generated by the hive mind's collective consciousness, projecting itself into the immaterium, even though the hive mind does not reside there, and does not engage with it in any of the ways other, psychically, active species do. The hive tyrant is the hive mind's most direct avatar on a battlefield, and it has psychic capabilities that manifest in ways broadly similar to how other psykers' abilities manifest, through the direction of psychic energy towards specific effects. The zoanthropes are explicitly psychic specialists. How does this work? How does a species that cannot interact with the warp in the conventional way have an overwhelming psychic presence in the warp? The answer seems to be that the hive mind's collective consciousness is itself so vast, so overwhelmingly present, that it cannot avoid having a psychic footprint, even without intentionally engaging with the warp. The warp is shaped by consciousness. The chaos gods are the ultimate expression of this, entities created and sustained by the collective emotional resonance of billions of minds. The hive mind is a consciousness of comparable or greater scale, and its presence in real space is dense enough to generate a corresponding signature in the warp, simply by existing. The shadow in the warp is, in this reading, not something the Tyranids do deliberately. It is what happens when something as large as the hive mind exists in close proximity to the warp. The psychic dimension cannot ignore a consciousness of that magnitude. It must respond. And its response, the suppression and static that fills the immaterium near a hive fleet, is the warp's version of flinching away from something too large to accommodate. Now consider what this means for the hive mind's perception of the Astronomicon and of the Emperor. The Astronomicon broadcasts a specific kind of psychic energy, the directed will of an entity of extraordinary power, shaped and focused through the sacrifice of thousands of psykers, projected as a coherent signal across 50,000 light-years of the warp. From the perspective of the hive mind, which perceives psychic energy in terms of its signature, as biological potential, as the marker of living creatures, and the concentrations of them, the Astronomicon would read as the most intense concentration of psychic biological presence in the entire galaxy. Not the Astronomicon as a mechanical device, but the Emperor as the source of that device's power, the living star burning at its center, the most powerful psychic entity in the Milky Way. The Emperor, on the golden throne, is neither fully alive nor fully dead. He is sustained by constant psychic maintenance, by the sacrifice of psykers, by the sheer stubborn force of a will that has refused to release its grip on existence for 10,000 years. In the warp, this shows as an enormous, blazing presence, a psychic bonfire at the center of the galaxy. Every navigator who has ever used the Astronomicon perceives it as a guiding light, warm and directional. Every creature with even minor psychic sensitivity can feel it as a background warmth, a sense of direction, a distant presence. The Emperor is the most psychically visible thing in the Milky Way, and the hive mind is specifically attuned to detecting concentrations of psychic biological energy at range. This is how it finds feeding grounds across the void. This is how the Pharaoh signal was detected. This is how the Astronomicon was noticed from outside the galactic rim, and became the attractor that drew the hive fleets inward. The Emperor, generating that signal continuously, is the most visible possible target for a species that hunts by following the bright spots of psychic life. There is a specific terrible poetry to this. The Emperor sacrificed his individual existence to preserve the Imperium. He sits on the golden throne, burning away, diminishing over 10,000 years, sustaining humanity's civilization through the sheer enormity of what he was and what he continues to be. His sacrifice enables the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon enables the Imperium. And the Astronomicon simultaneously advertises the location of the Imperium's most vital point to the most dangerous predator in the galaxy. Drawing the swarm toward the Emperor as a moth is drawn to the lamp that will eventually kill it. The Emperor's sacrifice is the mechanism of his own destruction if the Tyranids are allowed to complete their advance. The light that guides humanity home is also the light that leads the darkness to the door. This is the kind of structural irony that Warhammer 40K builds its best lore from. Not coincidental tragedy, but tragedy that emerges from the fundamental nature of things, from the incompatibility between what must be done to survive and what must be sacrificed to do it. You cannot have the Astronomicon without the Emperor, You cannot have the Emperor without the signal that draws the swarm. The galaxy's survival mechanism contains within it the mechanism of its eventual consumption, unless something changes. And the lore has been carefully positioning the possibility that something might change, that the Emperor's current state is not his final state, that the Golden Throne and the long hibernation it enforces might be the setup for something that the setting has been building towards since the beginning. What that transformation looks like, whether it arrives in time, and whether it would be sufficient to change the calculation the Tyranids are making as they advance toward Segmentum Solar, is where the most forward-looking threads of the current lore point without yet arriving. Extended reflection on the scale of the Tyranid threat compared to other faction-level threats. It is worth spending some time on why the Tyranids occupy a specific place in the hierarchy of 40K threats that distinguishes them from every other faction, even the ones that are also existential threats by any reasonable measure. The Chaos Gods are existential threats to the Imperium and to every other faction that depends on psychic life persisting in the material universe. If Chaos achieves total dominion, if the warp fully merges with real space, the result is a universe of pure psychic madness in which material existence as currently defined cannot persist. This is genuinely existential. The Chaos Gods are not simply powerful enemies. They are incompatible with the continued existence of physical reality as experienced by biological organisms. The Necrons, in their full awakened state, with access to the technologies of their prime, are capable of ending star systems as a tactical option. Citan weapons, star-killing devices, the apparatus of an ancient civilization that was powerful enough to hold off the old ones at the height of their power. These are not modest capabilities. A fully awakened Necron dynasty, with full access to its ancient arsenal, could realistically contest for control of the galaxy. But neither Chaos nor the Necrons threaten to leave the galaxy completely empty. Chaos would transform the galaxy, not erase it. The warp's entities consume souls and madness and suffering, but they need those things to exist to consume them. A chaos-dominated galaxy is still a galaxy full of things, of demons and corrupted beings and tortured existences. It is terrible beyond human imagination, but it is not nothing. The Necrons, even at their most aggressive and expansionist, would presumably maintain life-bearing worlds as resources, as sources of biological material, as the environments in which the organic creatures that generate psychic energy reside. The Tyranids threaten to leave nothing. Not nothing in the catastrophic, but still something sense of chaos dominion, but actual nothing. Bare rock, stripped atmosphere. A galaxy that was once full of life and is now simply empty, circling its stars without anything on its surface or in its oceans that would qualify as alive. The silence that the Tyranids leave behind is more complete than any other potential outcome the setting describes. It is the silence of heat death, applied specifically to biological complexity, a universe that still contains matter, but contains nothing that organizes that matter into the patterns we call life. This is why the Tyranid threat is categorically different from other existential threats in the setting. They are not threatening to change the galaxy. They are threatening to end it in the specific sense of making it the kind of place where nothing further happens. No chaos. No demonic incursion. No ancient machine empires awakening. No bright young species rising from primitive technology to challenge the galaxy's older powers. Nothing. The Tyranids would consume the conditions that make all of those things possible, and what is left would be the kind of universe that the Chaos Gods cannot feed on, that the Necrons would find pointless, that nothing we can currently imagine would find habitable or useful or worth visiting. This is what makes the question of what is behind them so significant. If the Tyranids are the thing that makes the galaxy into nothing, whatever is behind the Tyranids is the thing that makes the Tyranids flee toward the galaxy, rather than continuing in whatever direction they had previously been going. That thing's relationship to the nothing that Tyranids leave behind is not the relationship of a superior predator to a lesser predator. It has to be something stranger, something that operates on principles that even the Great Devourer's infinite biological adaptability cannot address. The Tyranids face chaos and evolve chaos counter-organisms. They face space marines and evolve space marine counter-organisms. They face the specific challenges of a galaxy with a great rift dividing it, and they develop specialized fleets to address the warp energy contamination that Rift produces. This is what the Tyranids do with threats. They face them, they learn from them, they grow new tools to address them. They do not run from threats. They are not a species that runs. And yet, here they are, running, or having run, in the direction of the galaxy that lit up brightest in the dark, the galaxy that the Pharos overload pointed them toward, the galaxy that the Astronomicon marked with a blazing fire. Running toward our galaxy, our home, our wars and our tragedies, and our complicated, brutal, beautiful mess of civilizations. Whatever they are running from did not follow them here, not yet, or not that anyone has noticed. And the absence of whatever is behind them is itself a kind of silence, a different kind than the silence they leave behind, but equally complete. The galaxy's defenders are too busy fighting the Tyranids to look in the direction the Tyranids came from. No one has the resources to turn around and see what might be coming behind them. The Ordo Xenos analysts who think about this at all do so in private, in documents that are classified above almost any clearance level you might imagine, in conversations that rarely happen, and when they do happen, are not recorded. But somewhere in those conversations, in those private moments of reckoning, with the full scale of what the Tyranid presence implies about the universe, the question gets asked, what if they are running from something? And what if that something is following? There is no answer. There is never an answer to that question. There is only the sound of the shadow in the warp advancing, and the silence of the worlds going dark ahead of the fleet, and the knowledge that whatever is behind it all has not yet made itself known. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and behind the war, there is something else, and it is waiting. Extended reflection on hope, endurance, and the meaning of resistance. The grim darkness of the far future is the setting's most famous self-description, and it is accurate. The 41st millennium is a place of relentless suffering and endless war, of civilizations grinding down under pressure from every direction simultaneously, of humanity clinging to survival through a combination of extraordinary violence and a bureaucratic inertia so vast it constitutes a form of institutional momentum. It is not, by any conventional measure, a hopeful setting. And yet, there is something that the Tyranid threat specifically reveals about the characters who fight them that is worth noting as we draw this exploration toward its close. Every other enemy in Warhammer 40K has, in some form, a narrative possibility of negotiation, accommodation, deterrence, or mutual destruction pact. Not that these things actually happen or work very often, but the logical space for them exists. You can, in principle, negotiate with orc warlords. They will probably betray you, and then the negotiations will end in violence. But the structure of a deal exists. Chaos gods make bargains. Terrible bargains with terrible prices, but bargains. Even the Necrons, ancient and coldly logical, operate within frameworks of territorial claim and strategic interest that allow for the theoretical possibility of mutual non-interference. The Tyranids admit none of these possibilities. There is no negotiation because the hive mind does not have a framework for concepts like territory, mutual benefit, treaty, or any of the other ideas that make negotiation meaningful. There is no deterrence because the hive mind does not fear consequences the way other entities fear them. It processes them as data about the efficiency of particular approaches and adjusts accordingly. There is no deal because the hive mind wants nothing that a deal could provide. There is only fighting or being consumed. This means that fighting the Tyranids is, in the clearest possible sense, a choice made without any expectation of the conflict, eventually ending through any mechanism other than the complete destruction of one side or the other. Everyone who fights the Tyranids fights knowing that they are fighting a force that will not stop, will not change its goals, will not be satisfied by partial victory, will not honor any arrangement made. They fight because the alternative is not to fight, and not fighting means being dissolved into nutrient broth in a reclamation pool. In the 41st millennium's overall context of wars that go on forever and empires that decline indefinitely, and dark gods that accrue power with each passing century, the Tyranid War is different in this specific way. It is a war that will eventually reach a conclusion. Either the Tyranids consume the Milky Way and everything in it, or something stops them. Both outcomes are possible in the internal logic of the setting. Neither is guaranteed. and the actions of individual people and factions in the present matter for determining which one happens. This is not hope in the soft, warm, everything will be fine sense of the word. It is something harder and more real than that, the kind of hope that consists specifically of refusing to accept that the outcome is already determined, of continuing to act as if what you do matters, even when the scale of what you face makes meaninglessness feel like the rational response. The Ultramarines at Macragge stood their ground, knowing they might not survive it, knowing the cost would be enormous, knowing that even victory would leave them diminished beyond their previous capacity. They stood anyway, because what else does a Space Marine do when the alternative is not standing? That stubbornness, that refusal to simply yield to the scale of the threat, is the galaxy's best argument against the Tyranids. Not a technological argument, or a strategic argument, or even a military argument. A characterological one. The Tyranids are the most efficient consuming machine in the universe. They have been perfecting that efficiency across millions of years and dozens of galaxies. What they have never encountered, because no other galaxy they have consumed has produced it, or if it has, the hive mind has not preserved that encounter in anything accessible to current analysis, refuses on principle, refuses against the math, refuses even when the math says stop. The Imperium of Man, for all its terrible failures and its centuries of institutional decay and its incalculable crimes against its own people, is fundamentally a civilization built on the refusal to yield. 10,000 years of being ground down by every force in the universe, and the Imperium is still there, diminished, scarred, perpetually on the edge of collapse, and still there. This is not noble. It is not pretty. It is frequently horrific. But it is persistent in a way that the setting suggests matters. That persistence against impossible odds is itself a form of meaning that the universe does not automatically provide, but that can be created by the refusal to accept meaninglessness. The Tyranids cannot be negotiated with. They cannot be deterred or diverted or satisfied. They can only be fought, and fighting them while knowing what they are and what is potentially behind them, and what the odds against ultimately stopping them actually are, and choosing to fight anyway, is the setting's most honest statement about what makes existence worth something, even in the grim darkness. The galaxy does not know what the Tyranids are running from. It may never know. It is fighting the Tyranids anyway, one battle at a time, one world defended at a time, at whatever cost that defense requires. In the end, that is the only answer any of this has to offer. Not certainty, not safety, not the reassurance that everything will be fine, just the choice to stand. On Macragge, on Baal, in the Bastior subsector, wherever the swarm advances next. To stand, and to fight, and to refuse to be nothing. That refusal is what makes the question of what the Tyranids are running from meaningful rather than simply terrifying. It is the evidence that the galaxy has something worth preserving. Something that, whatever is in the dark, behind the great devourer, is worth making the enemy face before they can have it. Thank you for walking through this question with me. It is one of the most genuinely fascinating and genuinely dark pieces of world building in all of Warhammer 40K, and I hope this exploration has given you something new to think about. Drop a comment, leave your theory, tell me where you are in the world, and if you want more of this, subscribe. There is much more to explore. Until next time.